Victorian England, an age of progress, empire, railroads, and being scandalized if you so much as touched someone's hand in public. You could build bridges, conquer continents, and invent the telegraph, but heaven forbid you gave your sweetheart a peck on the cheek in the street. That, dear listener, was practically a national emergency. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, the weirdest laws in the Victorian era, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Public displays of affection, or PDA as we call it now, were so frowned upon in the Victorian era that some places even enforced fines. Yes, in a time when industrial smoke turned your lungs into coal storage units, and children were literally climbing up chimneys for pennies. What really kept society up at night was the terrifying possibility that two people might kiss where others could see them. The reasoning? To the Victorian mind, public morality was like a fragile porcelain teacup. One wobble, and the whole empire might shatter. A kiss wasn't just a kiss. Oh no. It was a crack in the dam, a slippery slope to social collapse. If one couple could kiss in public, what was next? Dancing in the streets? Singing bawdy songs? Someone showing an ankle? Anarchy. So while you might imagine foggy London streets filled with horse-drawn carriages and street lamps, add this to the mental picture, a stern policeman lurking in the shadows, ready to fine you for giving your partner a goodbye kiss before catching the train. And here's the funny part. It wasn't even consistent. Some cities were stricter than others. In certain towns, a public kiss could earn you a ticket for indecency, while in others it was simply frowned upon. A disapproving glare from a passerby, followed by mutterings of "society is doomed." Basically, the law was like a parent who suddenly yells, "Don't do that," for no clear reason. But let's not kid ourselves. Victorian society loved rules about appearances. It wasn't just about kisses. It was about making sure people looked respectable, even if behind closed doors they were anything but. And believe me, behind those closed doors, things could get quite un-Victorian. This was the era that gave us prudishness on the streets, but entire underground markets for risque photographs, love letters, and shall we say, unmentionables. The Victorians were experts at double standards, purity in public, passion in private. Which brings us back to our star offender, the sidewalk smooch. Why did it cause such an uproar? Well, for one, Victorians saw kisses as deeply intimate, far more than we do today. A kiss wasn't casual. It was the sort of thing that happened in private, preferably under the approving gaze of a clergyman who had just pronounced you husband and wife. Doing it in public was like declaring to the world, "Yes, we are passionate, and no, we don't care if you choke on your tea about it." Naturally, this made people nervous. Public kissing blurred the line between romance and indecency. If you were respectable, you kept your lips to yourself until the curtains were drawn. The street, after all, was a shared moral space. You could spit in it, dump chamber pots in it, and watch drunk men wrestle in it, but heaven forbid you kissed someone. And yes, the irony was breathtaking. You could see a man passed out in the gutter with gin dribbling down his chin, or a street urchin picking pockets right in front of you, and society shrugged. But if you leaned in for a quick kiss, suddenly that was the downfall of civilization. The good news? You're in love. The bad news? The police are now involved. It went beyond just couples too. Even married people weren't spared. A husband kissing his wife goodbye at the train station could earn a sharp rebuke because public affection was seen as immodest, no matter how many vows you'd exchanged. Victorians were all about restraint, and if you couldn't restrain your lips, how could they trust you to restrain the rest of your sinful impulses? And for women, the stakes were even higher. If a lady was caught kissing in public, it could tarnish her reputation. Society might label her loose or improper. And once that label stuck, good luck finding a decent marriage proposal. In the grand Victorian dating game, your reputation was like your credit score. Once ruined, you were out of luck. It's worth noting that some of these fines and restrictions weren't codified into law books so much as enforced through a mixture of bylaws and the ever-watchful eyes of moral guardians. Imagine your nosiest neighbor, but backed by the authority of the city council. These people weren't just gossiping about you, they could actually get you in trouble. So what's the takeaway here? In the Victorian world, public affection wasn't just personal, it was political. Every kiss threatened to unravel the tightly wound spool of morality they had so carefully spun, or at least that's how they justified it. Meanwhile, today we barely blink at couples kissing on a park bench. If anything, Victorians would look at our modern world, movie kisses, wedding photo shoots, the average rom-com, and promptly faint into a lace handkerchief. But the real lesson, Victorian laws weren't just about justice, they were about control. They policed not only what people did, but how people appeared. And when appearance mattered more than reality, even something as innocent as a kiss could become a criminal offense. So next time you lean in for a public smooch, just be thankful you're not in Victorian England, where a kiss wasn't just romance, it was practically treason. In the late 19th century, bicycles rolled into the world like freedom on two wheels. They were affordable, relatively simple to ride, and for the first time people, especially women, had the power to go wherever they pleased without needing a horse, a carriage, or heaven forbid a chaperone. Naturally, this caused Victorian society to panic in ways only Victorians could, with wild medical theories, stern council regulations, and enough pearl clutching to keep jewelers in business for a century. For women, the bicycle was nothing short of revolutionary. Suddenly, you didn't need to wait for your brother to hitch up the family horse, or for your father to approve your every outing. You could hop on your bike and zoom, ride off down the street to visit friends, run errands, or simply feel the wind in your hair. It was liberation disguised as exercise equipment. But freedom is suspicious when you live in a society obsessed with keeping people in their proper place. So the humble bicycle quickly became a cultural battlefield. Local councils, mostly run by men who probably hadn't ridden anything more daring than a rocking chair in years, began wringing their hands about the sight of women pedaling unchaperoned. Some towns attempted to ban or restrict women from riding bicycles at all, declaring it indecent. Yes, you heard that right. Women sitting on a bicycle seat, gripping handlebars, and brace yourself moving under their own power was considered morally scandalous. To Victorian eyes, it wasn't exercise, it was rebellion. Each pedal stroke looked like an escape attempt from centuries of social control, and honestly, they weren't wrong. But the real comedy gold comes from the so-called medical experts of the time. Because, of course, nothing says science like inventing diseases to stop women from having fun. Enter the dreaded condition known as bicycle face. Doctors solemnly warned that women who rode bicycles risked developing a permanent expression of strain, bulging eyes, flared nostrils, flushed cheeks, and a grimace that apparently screamed, "I have seen things." According to these experts, too much cycling might leave women disfigured for life. Never mind that men who pedaled just as hard somehow escaped this terrifying affliction. Evidently, bicycle face was as selective as it was imaginary. Imagine losing your freedom of movement because some old guy thought you looked too determined while pedaling. That was the Victorian logic. A man could ride his bike down the street looking like he'd swallowed a wasp, and no one batted an eye. But a woman with slightly flushed cheeks from exercise? That was a public health crisis. And the medical warnings didn't stop at facial expressions. Other pearl-clutching theories claimed that bicycling could cause infertility, damage a woman's moral fiber, or, heaven forbid, give her a sense of independence. Some even fretted that riding astride a bicycle might lead women to discover pleasures not sanctioned by Victorian marriage. In short, too much freedom on a bike might make women uncontrollable, and that was the last thing polite society wanted. Naturally, fashion got dragged into this too. Victorian women's clothing was not exactly designed for pedaling. Corsets, floor-length skirts, and layers of petticoats were practically death traps on a moving machine. Riding a bicycle in such attire risked getting tangled in the wheels, or worse, toppling headfirst into the street. To solve this, some women adopted rational dress, a scandalous concept that included bloomers or shortened skirts. Cue the outrage. Not only were women riding around town unsupervised, now they were doing it in trousers. To some Victorians, this wasn't just indecency, it was the end of civilization as they knew it. If women could wear bloomers and control their own transportation, what was next? Voting? Running for office? Choosing their own husbands? Madness. Despite the hand-wringing, bicycles became wildly popular. By the 1890s they were everywhere, and women were some of the most enthusiastic riders. The suffragette Susan B. Anthony famously declared that the bicycle had done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. It was mobility, independence, and a way to literally leave old restrictions in the dust. And yet the resistance lingered. Some towns enforced ridiculous bylaws, like requiring women to ride only if fully covered, or forbidding them from riding without a man present. It was the legal equivalent of saying, sure, you can have freedom just as long as someone else is steering. But the more people complained, the more women pedaled. Cycling clubs sprang up, debates raged in newspapers, and cartoonists had a field day drawing caricatures of women zooming past shocked old men. Slowly but surely, the sight of women on wheels became less scandalous and more normal. Society eventually realized that bicycle face wasn't real. Bloomers were practical, and women hadn't in fact destroyed the moral fabric of the nation by riding to the bakery on their own. In hindsight, the panic seems absurd, but it reveals how even something as simple as a bicycle could shake the foundations of Victorian gender roles. The law and science weren't really about health or modesty, they were about control, who could go where, who could do what, and who had to ask permission first. So next time you hop on your bike for a casual ride, remember, in the Victorian era, that little act of pedaling could get you accused of indecency, medical malpractice, and moral corruption all at once. And perhaps most importantly, thank your lucky stars you don't live in a world where your doctor warns you that a morning ride might permanently rearrange your face. Sunday in Victorian England, a day of rest, a day of holiness, a day so utterly joyless that even yawning too loudly might get you side-eyed by a minister. The Victorians had Sunday Sabbath laws, also known as the Lord's Day Observance Acts, which made sure the seventh day was free from, well, pretty much everything fun. The rules were strict. No work, no sports, no theatre, no concerts. Shops were closed, taverns were shuttered, even playing cards could be frowned upon, because nothing says gateway sin like a rousing game of whist. The entire country was expected to grind to a halt, not for a national emergency, but because joy itself was considered hazardous to the soul. And this wasn't just polite suggestion territory. These were real laws, with real punishments. If you sold beer on a Sunday, you could be fined. If you organized a cricket match, you might find yourself hauled into court. If you dared open a museum or zoo, congratulations, you had just turned an innocent giraffe into an accomplice of Satan. The idea was simple. Sunday was for God, and anything not involving church, prayer, or very quiet reflection was basically a deal with the devil. Families were expected to spend the day in silence, reading the Bible, singing hymns, or contemplating their sins. And if that sounds dull, that's because it was. Victorian children who already worked 6 days a week in factories or schools probably longed for a bit of playtime. Instead, they were often told to sit still, read scripture, and think about how naughty they'd been. Childhood joy was postponed until Monday, assuming you survived boredom that long. If fun was spotted within 10 miles, the police could probably issue a warrant for excessive happiness. That's how it felt. Imagine trying to sneak in a quick game of cards, only to have your neighbor tattle that you were laughing too much. In fact, laughter itself was suspicious. A chuckle might be interpreted as sinful levity, the kind of thing that could corrupt society faster than gin or gambling. To modern ears, it sounds absurd, but the Victorian mindset was steeped in a long history of Sabbath laws stretching back centuries. The idea was to preserve moral order by enforcing a collective pause button once a week. The trouble was, that pause meant pressing mute on human enjoyment. Even Shakespeare had once run into trouble with earlier Sabbath restrictions, and by the 19th century, the Victorians had taken the idea to fresh extremes. Of course, not everyone agreed. Industrial cities were full of working-class people who had only one day off Sunday. For them, Sabbath laws felt less like moral guidance and more like theft. Imagine laboring 6 days a week in a soot-filled factory, then being told your one day of leisure couldn't include a pint, a stroll through the zoo, or even a lively kickabout in the park. Your reward for surviving the week was sitting quietly and trying not to sin. Workers began to push back, arguing that they deserved a real break. This led to heated debates about Sunday opening. Should museums be allowed to open? Should trains run so people could visit family? Should pubs serve beer to the weary masses? Every small concession was treated by conservatives like the collapse of civilization. In 1855, when London Zoo dared to open its gates on Sundays, critics wailed that wild animals would be less dangerous than the sinful example being set. The hypocrisy, of course, was rich. Wealthier Victorians often found ways to bend the rules. Private dinner parties, carriage rides, or quiet gatherings might slip under the radar. It was the working poor, who couldn't afford loopholes, who bore the brunt of enforcement. Sabbath laws weren't just about holiness, they were about control, making sure the lower classes stayed obedient and morally pure. And then there were the absurdities. You could technically walk, but if your stroll looked too much like sport, it could raise eyebrows. Playing the piano for church hymns was fine, but playing Chopin for your own amusement, that was worldly. You could read the Bible out loud, but don't even think about cracking open a novel. The Lord's Day was apparently allergic to fiction. Children were especially tormented. Accounts from the time describe little ones forced to sit indoors memorizing Bible verses while their toys gathered dust. To them, Sunday was the day when time slowed to a crawl. Adults spoke in hushed tones, windows were shuttered, and heaven help you if you so much as giggled during prayers. Some memoirs recall Sundays as a kind of weekly punishment, a grey cloud that loomed over the otherwise tolerable misery of Victorian childhood. But resistance grew, and slowly the laws loosened. By the late 19th century, campaigns for Sunday leisure gained traction. Public parks began opening for walks, more trains ran, theatres cautiously reopened their doors. It wasn't a revolution, but it was proof that people valued joy, even if it had to be squeezed into a single free day. Looking back, the whole thing seems like society weaponized boredom. The Victorians enforced laws against happiness, not because happiness was dangerous, but because it symbolized freedom, and freedom couldn't always be controlled. What better way to keep people disciplined than to deny them the simplest pleasures of life one day every week? So if you ever find yourself complaining about being bored on a Sunday today, remember this. At least no one's fining you for reading a novel, sipping a pint, or playing football with your friends. In Victorian England, you'd have been slapped with a warrant for excessive happiness before half-time. Ah, the Victorians. Masters of railways, inventors of photography, and absolute geniuses when it came to finding new ways to tax people for existing. And while we might laugh about a tax on windows or hats, nothing quite captures the Victorian spirit of squeezing a penny from anywhere possible like the dog tax. Yes, even your beloved scruffy mutt wasn't safe from Her Majesty's treasury. The dog tax was not an entirely Victorian invention. It had roots in earlier centuries, but in the 19th century it became a particularly painful burden for the working poor. In theory, the tax was designed to limit the number of stray or dangerous dogs roaming around the streets. In practice, it was yet another way to remind poor families that joy came with a government price tag. Congratulations, you finally saved up to buy a scruffy little dog. Surprise, the government just slapped a price tag on his tail. That was essentially the experience for countless families. A dog wasn't just a pet, it was a companion, a watchdog, sometimes even a working animal helping herd or guard. But with a tax slapped on ownership, thousands of poor households were forced to choose between paying for food or keeping Fido. Spoiler, the food usually won. And the tax wasn't small change either. For middle-class Victorians who could afford kennels, collars and fancy names like Percival III, the tax was an annoyance. For the poor, it was devastating. Many simply couldn't afford it, so they abandoned their dogs. Imagine city streets suddenly flooded with sad, hungry pups, tails wagging desperately in search of new homes. Society didn't just punish the poor, it punished their pets. Naturally, this led to a black market of tax-dodging dog owners. People hid their dogs indoors, walked them only at night, or pretended their furry companion was just a visitor. Some even disguised dogs as other animals. There are recorded accounts of people calling their terriers cats, or claiming their hounds were farm animals exempt from the fee. It was pet ownership, but with the thrill of organized crime. Of course, wherever there's a tax, there's an inspector. Enter the dog catchers and tax enforcers, men whose job it was to hunt down untaxed dogs. They were about as popular as parking wardens today, only with more barking involved. These inspectors patrolled neighborhoods, counting dogs, checking licenses, and sometimes confiscating animals if the fee hadn't been paid. For working-class communities, they weren't guardians of order, they were the villains who stole pets. The cruelty of it all was obvious. Families that had adopted dogs for comfort or protection were forced to watch them taken away. The abandoned strays that filled the streets weren't just sad, they became a public health nightmare. London, already a city struggling with sanitation and disease, now had to deal with packs of hungry, neglected dogs roaming through alleys. In trying to control one problem, the government created another. Classic Victorian policy making. Fix nothing, break everything. And the hypocrisy? Well, the wealthy, as usual, were exempt from real suffering. Rich households with sprawling estates and hunting hounds could easily afford the fee. For them, the dog tax was like an extra subscription service, slightly annoying but no big deal. Meanwhile, working-class families with one loyal mongrel felt the full sting of the law. The message was clear: pets were a luxury, not a right, and if you couldn't pay up, you didn't deserve one. The irony, of course, was that Victorians loved dogs. This was the age of Queen Victoria herself, who adored her own pets and helped popularize breeds like the Pomeranian. Dog shows became fashionable, dog breeding flourished, and the Victorians practically invented modern pet culture. But while the middle and upper classes paraded their perfectly groomed poodles and greyhounds, the poor were told their mutt was a taxable offence. Even more absurdly, the tax encouraged cruelty. With so many unwanted dogs, some towns turned to culling strays. Dog catchers weren't just collecting fees, they often captured and destroyed abandoned animals. The supposed law for public order became a death sentence for thousands of innocent creatures. It was, in a sense, a war on pets, waged by bureaucracy. The backlash was fierce. Animal welfare activists began to protest, arguing that the law was not only unjust to humans but needlessly cruel to animals. Newspapers published outraged editorials about abandoned dogs starving on the streets. For once, the Victorians' obsession with morality intersected with genuine compassion. By the late 19th century, campaigns to reform or abolish the tax gained traction. But the scars remained. For decades, ordinary people had to make heartbreaking choices: feed their children or keep their dog. The tax was a reminder that in the Victorian world, even companionship wasn't free. Looking back, it seems absurd that something as wholesome as owning a dog could be treated like contraband. Today, we celebrate dogs as loyal friends, emotional support animals, even internet celebrities. In the Victorian era, your loyal friend came with paperwork, inspections, and the looming threat of confiscation. So the next time your dog chews up your slippers or insists on barking at absolutely nothing at 3 a.m., just remember, at least you don't need to pay the government for the privilege of being annoyed. In Victorian England, that bark could cost you a fortune, or worse, the dog itself. Few jobs in history have ever screamed childhood nightmare quite like being a Victorian chimney sweep. While middle-class children played with wooden toys and read moralizing storybooks, working-class boys were being shoved headfirst into soot-filled flues, armed with little more than a brush, a cloth sack, and lungs that probably turned coal-black before their 10th birthday. It was so bad that Parliament eventually had to step in with laws against using children as chimney sweeps. The trouble? These laws were about as effective as asking the chimney politely to clean itself. The idea behind regulation was noble enough. By the early 19th century, reformers had noticed that forcing a child barely taller than a mop handle to wriggle through narrow smoke shafts was, well, barbaric. Children got stuck, they suffocated, they developed cancers from constant soot exposure. If they survived long enough to become adults, their backs were twisted and their knees wrecked. Public outrage grew, and eventually lawmakers declared, "All right, enough, no more sending tiny humans up fireplaces." But here's the problem. Victorians loved a clean chimney, and no mechanical brush in those early years worked quite as well as a small, terrified boy. So the laws were passed, and then promptly ignored. Enforcement was weak, inspectors were few, and master sweeps found creative excuses to keep their child labor force. "Oh no, sir, this lad isn't an employee, he's just an apprentice who happens to fit in flues better than adults." What a coincidence. Inspectors, when they did their rounds, had one peculiar job. They literally measured boys to make sure they weren't too young or too small. Nothing says public safety like checking if a 7-year-old can still fit up your fireplace. It was absurd bureaucracy in action. Imagine standing there with a ruler, deciding whether little Timmy was legal chimney material. If he was deemed too tiny, his employer could be fined. If he wasn't, up the flue he went. Of course, fines weren't always a deterrent. For poor families, sending a child to sweep was one less mouth to feed, and a source of desperately needed income. For master sweeps, the profit outweighed the risk, and for inspectors, well, turning a blind eye was often easier than shutting down the only cleaning method people trusted. So, despite the laws, the sight of soot-blackened children wandering the streets with brushes over their shoulders remained common well into the Victorian age, and the dangers were horrifying. Chimneys in London houses weren't neat vertical shafts. They twisted like architectural spaghetti. Children had to wriggle through bends barely wide enough for their bodies, scraping off soot as they went. Sometimes they became wedged inside, suffocating before anyone could pull them out. Other times they emerged gasping, their eyes stinging, their lungs full of soot. If you want to imagine childhood trauma, think less schoolyard bullies, and more your workplace is on fire and you are inside the walls. Medical conditions were rampant. The most infamous was soot-wart, a form of cancer of the scrotum, first identified in chimney sweeps. Yes, you heard that right. A job so filthy it literally caused cancer in children before modern medicine even fully understood what cancer was. Add respiratory problems, burns, and stunted growth, and you've got one of the worst resumes in history. Reformers fought hard to change this. Philanthropists and social campaigners pushed for stricter enforcement, arguing that mechanical brushes could do the job without sacrificing small humans. By the mid to late 19th century, technology finally improved enough to make brushes more efficient. Still, it wasn't a clean break. Old habits die hard, and some masters clung stubbornly to their human broomsticks. The public was divided too. On one hand, no one liked the idea of children suffering. On the other, no one wanted their chimney catching fire because the job wasn't done properly. It was a moral tug-of-war between pity for children and fear of house fires. And guess which one usually won? That's right, the fear of waking up roasted. The hypocrisy was astounding. Victorians prided themselves on being a moral and civilized society, yet many had no problem paying for chimney services that relied on the labor of a coughing, half-starved 8-year-old. It was out of sight, out of mind, as long as the soot was gone and the fire burned safely. Who cared how it happened? Eventually enforcement caught up. By the late 1800s, laws gained more teeth, inspectors got more serious, and the mechanical brush became standard. The era of child sweeps faded, though not without leaving generations scarred, literally and figuratively. So what's the takeaway? Chimney sweep laws tell us a lot about Victorian society. Progress came slowly, morality often stopped at the front door, and sometimes the best intentions were wrapped in red tape so ridiculous it might as well have been soot-stained itself. The good news? Children today don't have to spend their mornings climbing into flues armed with nothing but grit and desperation. The bad news? If your chimney's dirty, you still have to pay someone, though at least they're an adult with actual tools, not a traumatized child being measured for fireplace compatibility. If you ever thought buying a new hat was just about personal style, you've clearly never lived in Victorian Britain, where headwear was not only a fashion statement, but also a taxable offence. Yes, that's right, Victorian lawmakers in their infinite creativity found a way to put a price on fashion. The humble hat, whether a working man's cap or a lord's silk top hat, was not just an accessory, it was a liability. The hat tax wasn't a Victorian invention. It had roots in the late 18th century, when Britain was desperately trying to refill its treasury after wars with France and other expensive international escapades. By the 1790s, Parliament, clearly running out of ideas, decided to look at men's heads and think, that's taxable. Initially, the tax was framed as a hat duty. Shopkeepers selling hats had to pay licensing fees, and every hat sold came with a special tax label glued inside the lining. No stamp? The hat was illegal, and you could be fined for wearing it. Think of it as a proto-version of counterfeit designer goods, except instead of fake Louis Vuitton handbags, you were in trouble for your untaxed bowler. The Victorians loved hats. They weren't optional accessories, they were social signals. A man's hat could tell you everything. His class, his wealth, his job, even his moral character. A shabby flat cap, working class labourer, a tall silk top hat, gentleman of means, or at least someone pretending to be one. A woman's bonnet was equally important, signalling propriety, modesty, or, depending on the ribbons, whether she was available for courtship. So, naturally, taxing hats made sense to the government. After all, no respectable Victorian would leave the house without one. It was like taxing smartphones today. You couldn't escape it without looking suspiciously out of step with society. The real headache came in enforcement. Shops had to attach government-issued tax stamps inside every hat sold, and inspectors were tasked with making sure the system wasn't abused. This led to some absurd scenarios. Imagine being stopped on a London street, not for drunkenness, not for theft, but for a hat inspection. Men could be fined if their hat was missing the stamp, and shopkeepers risked ruin if caught selling unmarked headwear. And yes, there really were cases of hat detectives, revenue officers, who would sneak around peeking into hat shops or demanding to examine a gentleman's headgear. If that sounds ridiculous, remember, in the Victorian world, evading the hat tax was basically treated like smuggling contraband, only instead of opium or stolen jewels, it was a beaver felt top hat. One of the more absurd aspects was how the law treated hat ownership. If you owned more than one, you were effectively flaunting wealth, and that meant even more tax. Victorians were already obsessed with social hierarchy, and this tax reinforced the idea that fashion was tied directly to economic worth. Owning 5 hats didn't just say, I like variety. It said, I can afford the government's wrath. Naturally, poorer folks resented it. For them, hats weren't luxury items but necessities, protection from rain, soot, and the general grime of industrial Britain. Yet, every cap came with a financial penalty that hit the working class harder than the wealthy. Nothing like taxing the poor man's only umbrella, while the rich strutted around with their entire millinery collection. Yes, hat smuggling was real. When taxes distort the market, people get creative. Some tried reusing old tax stamps and sewing them into new hats. Others bought hats illegally from underground sellers who skipped the licensing fees. Picture a secret Victorian alleyway where a shady dealer whispers, "Pust, want a hat. Genuine beaver felt. No stamp. Don't tell the inspector." Of course, if you were caught, the punishment could be steep. This meant some Victorians lived in paranoia, not over being mugged, but over being fined for wearing an unlicensed fedora. What makes the whole system almost cartoonish is how utterly normalized it became. People joked about it in newspapers, satirists poked fun in magazines, and ordinary citizens grumbled about paying to cover their heads. Yet it lingered for decades, a constant reminder that the government could monetize even something as personal as what you wore on your scalp. The irony? While hats were taxed, other forms of public nuisance weren't. You could vomit in the street after too much gin, spit on the pavement, or accidentally terrify pedestrians with your runaway horse, and that was tolerated. But heaven forbid you wear an untaxed trilby. Eventually, public frustration won. By the mid-19th century, the hat tax had become increasingly unpopular, especially as it disproportionately burdened the poor and created an entire black market of untaxed headgear. In 1811 it was finally abolished, much to the relief of everyone who had been hiding contraband caps under their beds. Yet the memory of it stuck. For decades the hat tax was remembered as a symbol of government overreach and absurdity, proof that lawmakers would tax anything if given the chance. Imagine saving up weeks of wages to buy your first nice hat, something that made you feel respectable, perhaps even dashing. You step out proudly, only to be stopped by a stern inspector demanding to see your tax stamp. Congratulations, you're not just a man in a hat, you're a man in a regulated accessory. The Victorians may have loved order, but when it came to hats, they turned style into a crime scene. Forget the fashion police. The Victorians literally had tax detectives rifling through your headwear. You weren't just wearing a hat, you were wearing evidence. If there's one thing governments throughout history love, it's telling people when, where, and how they can have a drink. And the Victorians were absolute champions at it. The 19th century was a battlefield where pint glasses and prayer books clashed, and the so-called war on alcohol produced some of the strangest laws, loopholes, and outright absurdities. If you wanted a quiet pint at your local tavern, you first had to navigate a labyrinth of licensing restrictions designed to keep you both sober and morally pure, which usually meant neither. At the heart of it all were the licensing laws. These were a set of restrictions that dictated exactly when pubs could open, how long they could serve alcohol, and who could be let in. In practice, this meant that if you worked long hours in a factory and got off late, you might find the local pub already shuttered by law. Nothing says civilized society like a group of exhausted workers staring sadly through a locked door at barrels of beer they weren't allowed to touch. Even Sundays weren't safe. Strict Sabbath rules often shut down drinking entirely, forcing Victorians to spend the day sober and contemplative, which is a polite way of saying miserable and thirsty. Naturally, these restrictions led to creativity. Human beings, after all, are endlessly inventive when their booze supply is on the line. Enter the golden age of medicinal tonics, those miraculous bottled cures that promise to fix everything from headaches to broken hearts. The catch? They often contained more alcohol than a pub's strongest ale. You couldn't buy a pint on Sunday, but you could legally buy something called Dr. Feelgood's Nerve Restorative that just happened to be 40% proof. Doctors may have been divided on the health benefits, but one thing was clear: the patients were having a very good time. This is also when temperance beverages began to flood the market. At least, that's what they were advertised as. Take lemonade, for example. On the surface, it was the perfect wholesome drink for the teetotaling family. But in reality, many a so-called lemonade was laced with gin, vodka, or whatever the brewer had on hand. The name alone gave cover, because what moral busybody was going to object to a man ordering just a lemonade after work? Imagine the confusion when little Johnny asked for a sip of his father's drink and immediately discovered that citrus zest wasn't the only flavor in the glass. The irony was staggering. The very laws designed to keep people sober ended up making alcohol consumption sneakier, stronger, and sometimes downright dangerous. Without regulation on these miracle tonics and fake lemonades, some concoctions were so potent they could knock a grown man flat. Others contained toxic ingredients because manufacturers weren't exactly prioritizing health over profit, if you were unlucky. Your innocent-looking lemonade didn't just blur your vision, it blurred your lifespan. Meanwhile, the temperance movement, the crusade against alcohol, was out in full force. Societies formed, sermons were preached, and endless pamphlets were printed warning of the moral decay that came with a pint of beer. Families were urged to replace their pub nights with wholesome activities like Bible reading or staring silently at the wall. But in practice, these restrictions only widened the gap between the law and reality. The harder the authorities clamped down, the more Victorians found loopholes. If you couldn't drink at a pub, you drank at home. If you couldn't buy whiskey, you bought cough syrup. If you couldn't have gin, you settled for fortified lemonade. The battle was less about eliminating alcohol and more about making people get very creative with labels. Of course, this war on alcohol also sparked a few unintended cultural shifts. The rise of soda fountains, mocktail-like beverages, and even some early branding tricks can be traced back to these restrictions. Manufacturers knew they had a captive market, people who couldn't buy a legal pint but still craved something fizzy and fun. And so, in the attempt to stamp out drinking culture, the Victorians accidentally laid the groundwork for Coca-Cola and the modern soft drink industry. Yes, the same laws that tried to make the empire sober also gave us the global sugar addiction we live with today. So picture it, a London worker in 1870, ducking into a shop, nervously buying a nerve tonic, and leaving with what is essentially moonshine in a medicine bottle. Outside, a policeman sternly watches for signs of public drunkenness. Inside, the shopkeeper smiles knowingly while handing over another miracle cure, and all the while the official pub down the street sits closed, its casks untouched. The war on alcohol wasn't about stopping people from drinking. It was about making drinking so complicated that half the fun was simply finding a legal way to do it. The funny part? For all their moral posturing, Victorians still drank. They drank in secret. They drank under false labels. They drank enough lemonade to convince themselves they were just being fashionable. The laws may have restricted hours and licenses, but human determination and thirst proved stronger than any regulation. The real miracle cure of the Victorian era wasn't tonic water, it was sheer stubbornness. If you've ever complained about your swimsuit being uncomfortable, let me introduce you to the Victorian bathing dress, a heavy woolen contraption that could probably double as a small tent. Forget bikinis, forget Speedos. Victorian beachwear was designed not to flatter, not to help you swim, but to make sure that every conceivable inch of human flesh was properly concealed from scandalized eyes. In an age where ankles were considered seductive, the seaside became a battlefield of morality, wool, and mild drowning hazards. The idea of modesty at the beach wasn't just a cultural preference, it was law. Local councils and beach authorities drew up strict rules about what people, especially women, could and couldn't wear. A respectable woman could not simply splash around in a lightweight frock or, heaven forbid, show her calves. Instead, she was expected to don a full bathing dress, a knee-length tunic worn over bloomers with sleeves down to the wrists, high collars up to the chin, and often accompanied by stockings and bathing shoes. And yes, this was all made from wool, because nothing says refreshing summer swim like carrying the equivalent of a wet carpet on your body. Men didn't escape scrutiny either. By the late 19th century, some beaches required men to wear full-body bathing suits that covered from shoulders to knees because bare chests were considered obscene. The sight of a man's torso, something that today only alarms you when you see it pressed against the glass at a bus stop, was enough to ignite moral outrage. In fact, there are records of beach inspectors patrolling the sand, making sure that men's suits covered from the neck to the knee, and that women's outfits were suitably modest. The strangest part of all this, bathing machines. Yes, these were actual wooden huts on wheels that women would climb into, change into their woolen water torture devices, and then be rolled directly into the sea by horses. This allowed them to step into the water without ever being seen in their swimsuits on land. Imagine spending all morning lacing up stockings, buttoning bloomers, and tying bonnets, only to get pulled into the ocean like a very overdressed lobster. And then there were the beach censors, inspectors and police officers whose sole job was to make sure no one's hemline crept too high or sleeves rolled too low. They weren't shy about enforcing it either. Women could be fined or kicked off the beach for wearing a bathing suit deemed too short. Men could be ordered off the sand for exposing a scandalous chest. Newspapers sometimes published editorials warning against indecent displays at the seaside, which usually meant someone had dared to bare a bit of forearm. Truly, Victorian society's greatest enemy was the human elbow. The irony, of course, is that the Victorians had flocked to the seaside precisely because it was supposed to be healthy. Doctors recommended sea air and saltwater bathing as cures for everything from tuberculosis to melancholy. But the medical advice rarely included the caveat that you'd be wading into the waves with an anchor of wool dragging you down. In fact, drowning incidents were surprisingly common, as swimmers found themselves pulled under by their own clothing. A day at the beach could quickly turn from invigorating health retreat to wool-based tragedy. Meanwhile, entrepreneurs saw opportunity in all this regulation. Shops near popular beaches sold ready-made bathing costumes, all carefully marketed as regulation approved. Pattern books for home-sewn suits emphasized modest cuts and wool fabric, with helpful illustrations of women smiling serenely in what can only be described as waterlogged pajamas. Families posed for photographs in their beachwear, the men looking faintly miserable, the women faintly strangled by their collars. But inevitably, cracks in the system began to show. By the 1890s, younger and more daring beachgoers began pushing the limits. Men started peeling off their tops, much to the horror of officials. Women experimented with shorter sleeves and higher hemlines, claiming practicality over rebellion. Public debates raged in local councils about whether a woman's exposed knee would shatter civilization. Spoiler, civilization survived. By the early 20th century, reforms began to ease restrictions, paving the way for more comfortable, breathable swimsuits that didn't threaten to drown the wearer on contact. Still, the Victorian era's bathing suit rules remain one of its most absurd examples of how fashion, morality, and law intertwined. On one hand, you had a society that was supposedly advancing in science, medicine, and technology. On the other, you had grown men in uniform measuring fabric at the beach, like tailors for the morality police. The result was a curious paradox. Victorians went to the seaside for freedom, health, and fun, but were immediately shackled by rules that ensured none of those things could fully happen. It was a time when going for a swim was less about relaxation and more about surviving wool-based suffocation under the watchful eye of a local inspector. And if you think your modern swimsuit is unflattering, just be glad you weren't trying to paddle through the waves dressed like a drowned governess. One of the more baffling quirks of Victorian society was its obsession with protecting animals, while often shrugging at the abuse of children. Yes, you heard that right. If a man kicked his donkey in the street, he might find himself in front of a magistrate. But if the same man cuffed his child across the room, society might well nod approvingly and declare, character building that. This contradiction was written into the very laws of the era, creating a strange moral hierarchy where pets sometimes enjoyed more legal compassion than people. The very first piece of animal protection legislation in Britain was the 1822 Martin's Act. Named after MP Richard Martin, it prohibited cruel treatment of cattle, horses, and sheep. This law was revolutionary at the time. It marked the birth of the idea that animals had rights, or at least deserved not to be beaten in public view. 2 years later, Martin and his allies founded the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which later gained the Royal Seal and became the RSPCA. Suddenly, London had inspectors prowling the streets looking for overworked dray horses, neglected dogs, and cattle being driven too hard. The city was filling with posters, pamphlets, and earnest sermons reminding people that cruelty to animals was both sinful and illegal. Meanwhile, what about children? Well, Victorian laws were far slower to recognize that young humans might also need protection. Until the late 19th century, beating children wasn't just tolerated, it was considered part of a good education. Schools routinely used canes, birch rods, and leather straps, often with parental encouragement. At home, discipline could be even harsher, and the law looked the other way. There was no society for the prevention of cruelty to children until 1884, over 60 years after animals got their own organization. If that timeline feels upside down, it's because it absolutely was. One of the more absurd ironies came in court cases. In 1870, newspapers reported on a man who was fined for brutally beating his donkey with a stick. while in the very same session another case saw a father who had struck his child until she bled let off with only a warning. Judges often seemed more comfortable handing down punishments for cruelty to animals than for cruelty to offspring. The message was clear. Society would not tolerate abuse of a beast of burden, but it would happily tolerate abuse of the small humans who did the laundry and fetched the coal. There's also the matter of factory children. By the early Victorian era, children as young as 6 were still working in mills, mines and match factories in conditions that would make a mule cry. While the Factory Acts eventually introduced restrictions on child labour, the changes came slowly and were often ignored by employers. Inspectors sometimes found children working 12-hour days in suffocating rooms, their health permanently damaged. Yet society still managed to pour more outrage into a horse whipped too hard on Oxford Street than into a boy coughing himself into an early grave in a matchstick factory. Part of the reason for this strange legal imbalance was public perception. Animals, especially pets and workhorses, were seen as helpless creatures entirely at the mercy of humans. Children, by contrast, were thought to need discipline, even harsh discipline, to grow into proper adults. Spare the rod, spoil the child wasn't just a proverb, it was a way of life. And while reformers like Lord Shaftesbury campaigned tirelessly for child welfare laws, progress lagged far behind that of the animal protection movement. Of course, not everyone was blind to the irony. Social commentators and satirists frequently mocked the fact that Britain was quick to defend the dignity of donkeys while ignoring the plight of children. One writer in the 1860s quipped that a boy being beaten at home might wish to disguise himself as a spaniel, since society was far more likely to step in if a dog were harmed. These jabs reflected an uncomfortable truth. Victorian morality was deeply inconsistent, veering between compassion and cruelty depending on the species involved. It wasn't until the late 19th century that momentum finally shifted. The founding of the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children (NSPC) in 1884 marked the beginning of serious legal recognition that children too deserved protection. The group was modelled almost directly on the RSPCA, with inspectors tasked with investigating abuse and lobbying for new laws. It was, quite literally, inspired by animal welfare organisations, a telling reminder of just how backward the priorities had been. By the end of the Victorian era, children were beginning to receive at least some of the protections that donkeys had enjoyed for decades. But the strange fact remains, for most of the 19th century, if you wanted real legal protection from a beating, you were better off being born a horse. The contradiction makes Victorian Britain look both progressive and absurd at the same time. On the one hand, the early animal rights movement laid the groundwork for modern ideas about kindness and compassion. On the other, the delay in extending similar protections to children highlights how selective and inconsistent moral progress can be. If history teaches anything here, it's that societies don't always get their priorities straight. Sometimes they get them hilariously, tragically wrong. In the Victorian era, you didn't get to escape the long arm of the law, not even by dying. Death was supposed to be the great equalizer, but in Britain it came with a handbook, a measuring tape, and a bureaucrat ready to slap you with a fine if your coffin dared to deviate from regulations. The government had decided that even funerals, those solemn last acts of life, needed strict rules to keep everyone in line. Forget eternal rest. First, you had to wrestle with paperwork. By the mid-19th century, Britain had a problem with overcrowded cemeteries. Cities were ballooning, the population was booming, and the result was that graveyards started looking less like peaceful gardens of eternal sleep and more like grotesque compost heaps of humanity. Bodies were often stacked like cordwood, graves dug shallowly because there simply wasn't room, and in more than a few cases, the dead had a disturbing habit of resurfacing after heavy rains. This wasn't exactly the kind of thing that reassured the living, so Parliament stepped in with burial laws designed to restore some sense of order, or at the very least keep corpses from floating into the streets. One of the most notorious rules was about grave depth. The law required burials to be at least 6 feet deep, not because of any romantic notion of 6 feet under, but because shallow graves were unhygienic and downright dangerous. The Victorians were obsessed with the idea of miasma, those poisonous vapors they thought wafted out of decaying bodies and caused disease. So, if you buried your loved one too close to the surface, you weren't just disrespectful, you were practically a biological terrorist. Grave inspectors, yes, that was a real job, had the authority to check burial sites and issue fines if they weren't dug properly. Picture it, a somber funeral, black-clad mourners weeping, and then a man with a ruler crouching in the hole to make sure grandma met regulation depth. Coffins, too, came under scrutiny. Burial laws dictated the materials used, ostensibly to prevent quick decay or leakage. Cheap wooden coffins were frowned upon, while sturdier constructions were encouraged or more accurately mandated. For poor families, who already struggled to afford even the humblest of burials, this was devastating. Imagine scraping together pennies to lay your loved one to rest, only to be told you couldn't proceed because the box wasn't up to government standards. It wasn't enough to be dead, you also had to pass quality control. The restrictions didn't stop at depth and coffins, location was tightly policed as well. In many towns, burials too close to houses or within overcrowded parish yards were strictly prohibited. Authorities feared that urban graveyards were breeding grounds for plague and cholera, and they weren't entirely wrong, but this meant many families were forced to bury loved ones miles away, turning a funeral procession into something closer to a hiking trip. Try grieving while lugging a coffin across town in the rain, only to be met with a clerk insisting you fill out the proper forms before lowering it into the earth. And if you tried to bypass the system, the graveyard police were on you. Unauthorized burials could incur fines, and in some cases bodies were exhumed and relocated to approved cemeteries. Yes, the government literally dug people back up if they weren't satisfied. The idea of a haunting suddenly sounds less supernatural and more like some very annoyed relatives storming down to City Hall after their loved one was yanked from the ground by decree. The irony, of course, was that these rules often hit the poor hardest. Wealthy Victorians had sprawling family plots, private mausoleums, or enough money to bribe their way into respectable cemeteries. The working class, meanwhile, found themselves cornered by laws that seemed to suggest death itself was a privilege of the rich. Many paupers were consigned to mass graves, layered one atop another like some grim human lasagna, and woe betide the family who tried to sneak in a private grave. Nothing said rest in peace quite like a fine for tax evasion from beyond the grave. The burial laws were part public health, part social control, and part obsession with order. They revealed something deeply Victorian, the belief that rules, paperwork, and a healthy dose of bureaucracy could solve anything, even mortality. The funny angle is that ghosts in Victorian Britain probably didn't moan about unfinished business. They were just furious about being buried 2 inches too shallow and slapped with an administrative penalty. So next time you think modern bureaucracy is a nightmare, imagine trying to mourn a loved one while a grave inspector measures the hole, fines you for improper coffin dimensions, and threatens to dig them back up if you didn't follow the regulations. Even in death, Victorians couldn't catch a break. Eternal rest? Only if you had the correct permit, filed in triplicate, with the appropriate stamp duty attached. If there's one thing history has proven over and over again, it's that giving teenagers too much power never ends well. Most of us at 16 are still figuring out how to parallel park, survive acne, or avoid complete humiliation in gym class. Nero, on the other hand, was figuring out how to run the largest empire on earth. Rome didn't just hand him a learner's permit for life, it gave him the whole chariot, the racetrack, and the cheering crowds and said, "Go nuts, kid." Nero was born in 37 CE, the only son of Agrippina the Younger and Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus. Now, if you're thinking those names sound like they belong to villains in a soap opera, you're not far off. Rome was a city full of schemers, backstabbers, and politicians whose favorite pastime was inventing new ways to poison each other. Little Nero's family fit right in. His father wasn't exactly the Roman equivalent of Dad of the Year. In fact, The historian Suetonius described him as both violent and dishonorable, which is a polite way of saying, if there had been a worst Roman dad award, he would have won it 3 years running. When Nero was only 2 years old, his father died, probably to the relief of everyone who had to deal with him. Agrippina, however, was not exactly the nurturing single mom type. Imagine Lady Macbeth raising a toddler, doting, yes, but only because she saw future emperor stamped across his forehead. She quickly married into power circles, maneuvering like someone who treated life as one long chess match, where her son was the queen piece. But here's the catch. Little Nero wasn't the obvious heir. The emperor at the time was Claudius, a man who had risen to power after his nephew Caligula was assassinated. Claudius was bookish, awkward, and often underestimated, but he was still emperor, and more importantly, he already had a biological son, Britannicus. By all rights, Britannicus should have been next in line, but Agrippina had other plans. In a move that makes modern family dramas look tame, Agrippina married her own uncle Claudius. Yes, uncle. The Romans may have frowned on bad table manners, but marrying inside the family tree, totally negotiable if it came with political perks. With this marriage, she planted young Nero firmly in the imperial household. She then convinced Claudius to adopt Nero in 50 CE. Adoption in Roman politics wasn't about giving a kid a stable home, it was about rewriting the inheritance rules. By making Nero his son, Claudius essentially said, "Congratulations, Britannicus, you've been demoted in your own family." From that point, Nero's life became a training montage, except instead of Rocky Balboa punching meat, Nero was learning rhetoric, philosophy, and the fine art of pretending to like senators. His tutors included the philosopher Seneca, who tried to mold him into a wise and balanced ruler. You might recognize Seneca as the guy who wrote all those inspiring Stoic quotes about self-control and moderation. Ironically, trying to teach Nero moderation was like trying to train a cat not to knock things off a shelf. When Claudius conveniently died in 54 CE, likely thanks to a plate of suspicious mushrooms served by Agrippina, Nero was suddenly emperor at the age of 16. 16! Most of us would have been thrilled just to get our driver's license at that age. Nero got the keys to the Roman Empire, an army of hundreds of thousands, and control over nearly 60 million people. This was Rome at its absolute height, a sprawling empire stretching from Britain to the Middle East, packed with wealth, monuments, and enough political intrigue to fuel every season of Game of Thrones. It needed stability. It needed wisdom. It needed someone who could unite the Senate, the military, and the people. Instead, it got a teenager with artistic ambitions, a controlling mother, and a taste for luxury that made Marie Antoinette look frugal. At first, though, Nero surprised everyone. The opening act of his reign was actually decent. With Seneca and a competent general named Burrus guiding him, Nero made some smart decisions. Taxes were reduced, corrupt officials were punished, grain supplies were stabilized. For a fleeting moment it looked like Rome might have lucked out with this kid. The Senate praised him, the people loved him, and everyone sighed in relief. It was like when your irresponsible cousin suddenly lands a steady job. You think maybe, just maybe, they'll pull it together. But the cracks were already forming. Beneath the surface, Nero was less Julius Caesar and more wannabe pop star. He wasn't interested in governance so much as applause. He loved music, poetry, and theatre more than military campaigns or Senate debates. Rome didn't want an emperor who could hit high notes. It wanted an emperor who could keep the barbarians out. And therein lay the problem. When you hand a 16-year-old supreme power, they don't always ask, how do I maintain an empire? More often they ask, can I make everyone listen to my lute solo? So, picture it, a teenage emperor, propped up by his ambitious mother, mentored by one of the wisest philosophers of the age, ruling over the largest empire in the world. The stakes couldn't be higher. And yet Rome had essentially put the fate of civilization in the hands of someone who, in today's terms, might have been writing moody poetry in a notebook and strumming badly on a guitar. Or, as you might put it, imagine handing the nuclear codes to a high school sophomore who still writes bad poetry. The empire held its breath. For now, Nero seemed like a promising young ruler. But if history has taught us anything, it's that teenage emperors rarely age like fine wine. Spoiler, things were about to get very messy. If you thought your mum hovering over your shoulder while you did homework was bad, imagine your mum hovering over the entire Roman Empire. That was the reality for young Nero. He may have been the emperor, technically, but his mother Agrippina the Younger was the one pulling the strings. In the first years of his reign, Rome didn't have one ruler. It had a duo, a teenage boy and his terrifyingly ambitious mother. And guess which one was actually running the show? Agrippina wasn't just any Roman matron. She was descended from some of the most famous names in Roman history. Her great-grandfather was none other than Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. That meant she had the pedigree, the connections, and the kind of self-confidence that comes from knowing your family tree is basically the ancient version of a royal blue checkmark. She had also survived the political chaos of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which was basically like living inside a blender set on backstab. By the time her son took the throne, Agrippina had already proven she was both cunning and ruthless enough to survive Rome's deadliest game, politics. So when Nero became emperor at 16, the Roman Senate might as well have issued Agrippina her own title, co-emperor, unofficial. Coins minted at the time even featured her image alongside Nero's, an extraordinary move, since women usually didn't get their faces stamped on imperial money unless they were deified or dead. But Agrippina wasn't deified, and she was definitely not dead. She was just that powerful. Her involvement went far beyond ceremonial appearances. Agrippina sat in on Senate meetings, greeted foreign ambassadors, and made key decisions about Rome's administration. In one infamous account, she even tried to climb onto the imperial platform to sit beside Nero while he received visiting dignitaries. It was the ancient Roman equivalent of a mum insisting on joining your Zoom job interview just to make sure you don't say anything silly. At first, this arrangement worked. Agrippina had spent years maneuvering to get Nero on the throne, and now she was determined to keep him there. She used her influence to protect him, remove threats, and ensure that key political figures supported his reign. Roman nobles who thought they could manipulate a teenager quickly learned they had to go through his mother first. Agrippina wasn't just a stage mom, she was a political bouncer, keeping the Senate in line and making sure her son looked like a competent ruler, even if he was more interested in music lessons than governance. But as with all mother-son dynamics, especially ones involving unlimited imperial power, things started to get awkward. Nero was growing up, and the older he got, the less thrilled he was about sharing his spotlight with mum. Imagine trying to rule an empire when your mother insists on correcting your speeches and critiquing your toga choice. Ancient sources describe Nero chafing under her control, and it's not hard to see why. Agrippina's authority was so overwhelming that he probably felt less like an emperor and more like a kid whose allowance happened to include the Roman treasury. The cracks in their partnership became most obvious in their very different approaches to ruling. Agrippina was pragmatic, cunning, and all about maintaining the family's grip on power. Nero, meanwhile, leaned toward extravagance, self-indulgence, and anything that would let him feel adored by the masses. To Agrippina, Nero's artistic tendencies were embarrassing distractions. To Nero, Agrippina's constant interference was suffocating. Their tension wasn't just family drama, it spilled into politics. Agrippina tried to maintain influence by aligning herself with key senators and even reminding Nero that his adopted brother Britannicus, the biological son of Claudius, was technically still a rival for the throne. Nero, paranoid and eager to assert his independence, started looking for ways to sideline his mother. It was like the world's deadliest tug-of-war match. On one side, a teenager desperate for autonomy. On the other, a mother who refused to let go of the reins. One vivid episode that captures their power struggle involved Nero's first wife, Octavia, who was the daughter of Claudius. Agrippina adored Octavia because she solidified Nero's connection to the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Nero, however, wasn't particularly fond of his arranged bride. He was far more interested in other women and men, and resented Agrippina's attempts to dictate his personal life. Their arguments over Octavia became symbolic of a larger battle. Agrippina wanted Nero to play the respectable emperor, while Nero wanted to play, well, literally anything else. All of this tension boiled down to one humiliating truth. Nero may have been emperor, but everyone knew his mother was the real power. Ancient satirists and historians loved to poke fun at this arrangement. After all, how impressive could an emperor look when he couldn't make a decision without mum's approval? As one modern historian Riley put it, "It's hard to look powerful when your mum still tells you to clean your toga." For a while, Nero tolerated her dominance, perhaps out of fear or perhaps because she was just too useful as a political shield. But as his confidence grew and his ambitions turned toward more extravagant pursuits, Agrippina's shadow loomed larger and larger. Rome wasn't big enough for both of their egos. In the grand tradition of Roman family drama, this power struggle was destined to end badly. But that's a story for another chapter. For now, it's enough to picture Nero sulking in his golden palace, strumming a lute, while his mother stood behind him with a glare sharp enough to pierce armor. He may have been the emperor, but Agrippina was the puppet master. Most emperors of Rome dreamed of conquest, glory, and immortal statues. Nero dreamed of applause. If you had wandered into his palace late at night, you probably wouldn't have found him discussing tax reforms or military campaigns. You'd have found him practicing scales on his lyre, reciting verses with dramatic pauses, or humming a tune he was absolutely certain would top the charts if Rome had charts. Nero wasn't just an emperor, he was a frustrated artist trapped in the wrong job. Think Caesar Augustus meets high school glee club. Here's the thing, in Roman society, performing arts were not for emperors. Sure, Romans loved entertainment. They packed theaters, adored chariot races, and couldn't get enough of gladiators slicing each other up like it was a sport. But performing on stage was considered beneath the ruling class. Senators and patricians watched. Actors and musicians entertained. Emperors, in theory, stayed above it all, wrapped in dignity. If a ruler wanted to dabble in the arts, he was supposed to do it quietly at home, not drag the entire empire into his creative journey. Nero, however, didn't see it that way. To him, there was no higher calling than the stage. He fancied himself a poet, a singer, an actor, a musician, basically a one-man talent show. He believed his gifts were divinely inspired. The empire might have wanted a general, but Nero wanted to be the Beyoncé of the ancient world. And Rome couldn't say no, because saying no to the emperor was a fast track to exile or worse. When Nero organized performances, attendance wasn't optional. Senators, nobles, and ordinary citizens were required to show up and sit through his shows. The problem: Nero's performances were not short. Ancient accounts describe him singing and reciting for hours on end. Audiences weren't allowed to leave until he finished. Some historians gleefully recorded tales of desperate spectators pretending to faint, sneaking out, or even giving birth in the theater just to escape. Imagine being stuck in a 6-hour one-man show where leaving gets you executed. Hamilton might be long, but at least you can go home afterward. Nero wasn't content with just dabbling in the arts privately. He wanted public recognition, so he entered festivals and competitions, though of course nobody dared outshine him. If Nero was a contestant, Nero was the winner. Shocking, right? It was like competing against the judge on a talent show where the prize was survival. To make things even more scandalous, Nero often performed in roles that were downright humiliating for a Roman emperor. He would appear on stage in costumes, sometimes playing commoners or slaves, which horrified the elite. To Romans, the emperor was supposed to be a godlike figure, not someone pretending to milk a cow in a skit. But Nero didn't care. For him, it was art. For everyone else, it was awkward family theater night. Except the family was the entire empire. And it wasn't just singing and acting. Nero was obsessed with chariot racing, another passion that scandalized the aristocracy. Driving a chariot in the circus was considered a dangerous, low-status profession, reserved for the working classes or slaves who had risen in the sport. But Nero wasn't content to clap from the imperial box. He wanted to race. Picture your boss announcing at Monday's meeting that they'll now be competing in monster truck rallies and demanding you cheer them on. He even declared himself a champion charioteer in competitions where conveniently he was the only competitor. In one famous instance, he won a race despite falling off his chariot before finishing. Rome didn't care about the technicalities. The emperor had participated, so the emperor had to win. It's the kind of logic that makes participation trophies look humble. What makes all of this even funnier and sadder is that Nero wasn't necessarily bad. Some sources grudgingly admit that he could sing decently and perform competently. The real scandal wasn't his talent level, but the sheer audacity of thinking the emperor should be doing it at all. It was as if the President of the United States suddenly quit politics to pursue stand-up comedy, insisting the nation sit through 3-hour specials every Friday. Nero's passion for performance wasn't just a hobby, it became his identity. He saw himself as an artist first, emperor second. He staged elaborate festivals, built performance spaces, and poured resources into entertainment. This obsession not only alienated Rome's elite, but also drained attention from the business of empire. While provinces squabbled and legions needed leadership, Nero was busy writing lyrics about love, loss, and possibly how misunderstood he was. For the Roman people, it was a confusing experience. On one hand, many commoners enjoyed the free shows and games Nero sponsored. They didn't care if the emperor wanted to prance on stage. Free bread and circuses were always welcome. On the other hand, Rome's ruling class watched in horror as imperial dignity crumbled into interpretive dance. So in these early years of his reign, Nero's theatrical ambitions set the tone for the kind of emperor he would be. One who valued performance over politics, applause over administration, and while he may have thought himself a cultural icon, Rome was left wondering if their ruler had mistaken the empire for an open mic night. Because really, what could possibly go wrong when the most powerful man in the world decides he's destined not for greatness on the battlefield, but for a standing ovation at the amphitheater? Every family has drama. Some argue over who forgot to bring dessert to Thanksgiving. Others debate who gets the good spot on the couch. But if your family dinners feel tense, just be glad you weren't related to Emperor Nero, because in his household, disagreements didn't end with passive-aggressive comments. They ended with poison, daggers, and occasionally a collapsing boat. To put it bluntly, family dinners were less pass the bread and more pass the dagger. Let's start with the most famous victim of Nero's domestic management strategy, Agrippina the Younger, his mother. In the early years of his reign, she ran the empire like a stage mom, but as Nero grew bolder, he wanted her out of the spotlight. The problem? Agrippina wasn't the type to retire gracefully. She had clawed her way to power, and she wasn't about to let her teenage son push her aside. So Nero decided the only way to truly gain independence was to get rid of Mum permanently. His first attempt wasn't exactly subtle. He tried to poison her several times, but Agrippina had spent her entire life in Rome's poisonous political circles, and she knew her way around antidotes. According to ancient writers, she was practically immune after years of cautious practice. Think of her as the original tester of poison control, except her version involved drinking suspicious wine until her body shrugged and said, "Not today." Undeterred, Nero moved on to more creative assassination methods. His next plan was frankly theatrical. He designed a collapsible boat. The idea was to invite Agrippina for a nice mother-son boating trip, sabotage the vessel, and watch her drown in a tragic accident. For anyone else, this would have been a ridiculous idea. For Nero, it was Tuesday. He arranged for Agrippina to board the boat, and sure enough, the structure collapsed as planned. Except Agrippina didn't drown. She swam to shore, dripping wet and furious, like a Roman Jason Bourne. At this point, most emperors might have given up, but Nero doubled down. If poison and maritime engineering couldn't do the job, there was always the old-fashioned method: send in the assassins. Agrippina was stabbed to death in her villa in 59 CE. When Nero received word that she was finally gone, he reportedly tried to spin it as self-defense, claiming she had plotted against him. Few believed him. Everyone knew the emperor had just committed the ultimate act of mother issues. Unfortunately, Nero didn't stop with Agrippina. Once he realized how easy it was to edit family members out of his life, he made it a regular habit. Next on the chopping block was Octavia, his first wife. Octavia was the daughter of Claudius, Nero's adoptive father, and their marriage had been arranged to strengthen his legitimacy as emperor. By all accounts, Octavia was dutiful, quiet, and loyal. In other words, boring to a man like Nero. He quickly grew tired of her and became infatuated with Poppaea Sabina, a glamorous and ambitious woman who wasn't about to play second fiddle. To make room for his new love, Nero accused Octavia of adultery, a charge laughably hypocritical, considering Nero's own well-documented escapades. The people adored Octavia and rioted when she was sent into exile, so Nero reluctantly brought her back. But his patience didn't last long. Not content with merely divorcing her, he eventually ordered her execution. To add insult to injury, she was reportedly executed by being bound and suffocated with steam. Rome wasn't just watching a royal breakup, it was watching the emperor stage a horror show. Even Poppaea, the woman Nero loved enough to kill for, wasn't safe from his temper. Ancient accounts suggest that during a heated argument in 65 CE, Nero kicked her in a fit of rage while she was pregnant, killing both her and their unborn child. Whether this story was exaggerated by hostile historians or not, the fact that it circulated so widely shows how believable it seemed given Nero's track record. And then there was Britannicus, the son of Claudius, and the boy who should have been emperor. For Nero, Britannicus was a constant reminder that he wasn't the only heir with a claim to the throne, so naturally, Nero arranged for Britannicus to be poisoned during a banquet in 55 CE. Picture the scene. Everyone's reclining on couches, enjoying wine, and suddenly the emperor's stepbrother drops dead in his soup. The guests were horrified, but nobody dared to accuse Nero directly, because what's worse than eating bad oysters at dinner? Eating bad oysters at dinner while sitting next to a homicidal emperor. By this point, Nero had developed a reputation. He wasn't just a ruler, he was the most dangerous relative you could have. Cousins, wives, rivals, stepbrothers, no one was safe. The palace became less a home and more a live-action murder mystery, except the culprit was obvious, and the mystery was how anyone survived long enough to finish dessert. It's important to note that Roman historians loved to exaggerate. They despised Nero, so they likely embellished some of his crimes to paint him as even more monstrous. But even if only half the stories are true, Nero's household could have given Game of Thrones a run for its money. Power in Rome was always a matter of survival, but Nero turned family into fair game for elimination. So while other emperors dealt with external threats, barbarian invasions, rebellions, famines, Nero's greatest enemies seemed to be at his own dinner table. And if history is any indication, the safest position in his life was not as his mother, his wife, or his stepbrother. The safest position was as his audience, clapping politely at his poetry and praying he never invited you to dinner. Picture this. It's a hot July evening in 64 CE, and you're in Rome. The streets are cramped. Wooden buildings are stacked so close you can hear your neighbor's stomach growl, and there's no fire department unless you count buckets of water, sand, and a prayer to Vulcan, the god of fire. Suddenly, flames erupt in the Circus Maximus, the massive chariot racing stadium. Within hours, Rome is a barbecue, and the only thing on the grill is the city itself. For 6 long days the fire raged through Rome like it had been personally insulted. Eyewitnesses describe walls of flame leaping from roof to roof, entire neighborhoods vanishing overnight, and crowds of panicked citizens stampeding toward the river Tiber. Rome wasn't built in a day, but apparently it could almost burn down in one. Now, Rome was no stranger to fires, with its wooden tenements, narrow alleys, and cooking braziers left unattended. The city was practically begging for disaster. But this one was different. It wasn't just a random kitchen fire gone rogue. This blaze seemed determined to leave Rome looking like the world's largest ashtray. By the time the flames died down, 10 of Rome's 14 districts were damaged, and 3 were completely obliterated. Temples, homes, markets, gone. Imagine waking up and finding out your favorite bar, your cousin's bakery, and your local temple to Jupiter all got deleted overnight like bad files on a computer. And then of course there was Nero. History has a way of pinning this inferno squarely on him. The most infamous rumor? That Nero climbed to a tower, grabbed his lyre, and sang about the destruction of Troy while Rome went up in smoke. Basically the ancient equivalent of saying, yes, the Wi-Fi's down, but listen to this sick mixtape I just dropped. Whether this is true or not, it's exactly the kind of story that sticks because it's just too perfect. The emperor who thought he was a rock star strumming along as his capital disintegrated. But here's where things get complicated. Some sources, especially Nero-friendly ones, claim he wasn't even in Rome when the fire started. They say he was chilling at his villa in Antium, miles away, and rushed back as soon as he heard the news. In this version of events, Nero plays the role of the frantic leader, opening his palaces to shelter the homeless, organizing food relief, and coordinating firefighting efforts. Basically, a Roman version of disaster relief, minus the FEMA paperwork. So, which version is true? Did Nero really strum the world's worst concert during the crisis? Or did he do his best to help? The answer depends on who you ask. Roman historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio weren't exactly sending Nero fan mail. Their works are laced with accusations, scandals, and gleeful descriptions of his failures. If Nero had posted on Instagram, they'd have been the first to screenshot and roast him. Regardless of whether Nero caused the fire, what he did after didn't exactly help his PR. With most of the city in ruins, he seized large tracts of land cleared by the fire to build his luxurious Domus Aurea, the Golden House, complete with artificial lakes, gilded walls, and a massive statue of himself that screamed, "I love me more than you ever will." Imagine losing your home in a disaster, and the government swoops in to say, "Don't worry, we'll rebuild, but first, here's a giant mansion for the boss." People started connecting the dots. Fire conveniently wipes out large areas of prime real estate. Emperor suddenly has room for his dream palace. Public suspicion skyrockets. If Reddit existed in 64 CE, the conspiracy threads would have been endless. Hon/conspiracia. Did Nero burn down Rome for clout? To make matters worse, Nero needed a scapegoat to shift the blame, and he chose a small, unpopular religious sect that was just starting to spread, the Christians. They were already viewed with suspicion for their strange rituals and refusal to worship Roman gods. So Nero's spin was simple: I didn't do it, they did. What followed was one of the first major persecutions of Christians in history. They were arrested, tortured, and executed in horrifyingly creative ways. Some burned alive as literal human torches to light Nero's gardens at night. Even by ancient Roman standards, that was considered excessive. Now, here's the kicker. Whether or not Nero played music during the fire, whether or not he ordered it, history has forever remembered him as the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned. Never mind that the fiddle didn't even exist yet. The Romans used the lyre. Accuracy wasn't the point. The story was too delicious to pass up. Sometimes, history isn't about truth. It's about the best punchline. So what we're left with is this: a disaster that reshaped Rome, a rumor that defined an emperor, and the birth of one of history's most enduring memes. Rome eventually rebuilt, stronger and with more fireproof construction. But Nero's reputation? That never recovered. The city went up in flames, but Nero's legacy was permanently scorched. The fire of 64 CE left Rome in ashes, and Nero's reputation smoldering almost as badly as the city itself. People needed someone to blame, and unfortunately for Rome's budding minority religious groups, the emperor wasn't about to let all those angry citizens start pointing fingers at him. So Nero did what every desperate politician throughout history has perfected. He found a scapegoat. But not just any scapegoat. No. Nero zeroed in on a small, strange, and already unpopular group, the Christians. At this point in history, Christians weren't the dominant cultural force they would later become. They were more like an odd sect of Judaism that insisted on only one god, a weird idea in a city where you could practically trip over a new temple every other block. Their practices were secretive. Their refusal to participate in Roman sacrifices looked suspicious, and rumors swirled that they gathered for creepy nighttime rituals. In short, if you were looking for a group nobody would defend, Christians were a perfect choice. So Nero announced to the Roman people, the Christians did it. The beauty of this plan was that nobody really knew who Christians were, but everyone had heard weird whispers about them. Imagine living in a society obsessed with festivals, animal sacrifices, and honoring dozens of gods, and then hearing about a group who refused to eat pork, wouldn't burn incense to Jupiter, and kept going on about some guy named Christos who had been executed like a criminal. To the average Roman, that was either heresy or the setup to a very bad joke. The persecution that followed was one of the earliest organized crackdowns on Christians, and it wasn't subtle. Tacitus, the Roman historian who wrote about it, describes punishments so cruel they sound like the plot of a horror movie. Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed in ways that would make modern audiences squirm. Some were torn apart by wild beasts in the arena, the Roman equivalent of a blockbuster weekend spectacle. Others were crucified, a method Rome reserved for rebels and enemies of the state, meant to maximize both pain and public humiliation. And then there were the most infamous executions of all. Christians were covered in tar and set on fire to serve as human torches for Nero's garden parties. Yes, you heard that correctly. Imagine being invited to the imperial palace for an evening stroll in the gardens, only to realize the lighting scheme was powered by burning martyrs. It's the kind of event where you politely sip your wine and whisper to your date, "So, do we clap for this, or just slowly back away?" Nero, of course, presented all of this as an act of civic duty. He was purging the city of dangerous radicals who had supposedly set Rome ablaze. But everyone could see the cracks in the story. Even Tacitus, who wasn't exactly sympathetic to Christians, admitted that Nero's accusations looked more like political theater than justice. The Christians weren't universally loved, but turning them into human candles felt like a step too far, even by Roman standards. The humor here, if you can call it that, is that Nero essentially invented the first large-scale use of a scapegoat. Today, when leaders want to deflect attention, they might blame the media, immigrants, or a shadowy cabal of elites. Nero, he blamed an obscure religious minority most people hadn't even heard of yet. It's like if your town burned down and your mayor got on TV and declared, "Don't worry everyone, it was definitely the fault of those guys who meet in the basement every Wednesday to play Dungeons and Dragons." But here's the irony. Nero's cruelty didn't eliminate Christianity, it gave it a spotlight. Martyrdom, while terrible for the victims, became one of the most powerful recruiting tools the religion ever had. Stories of men and women refusing to renounce their faith, even as they faced lions, fire, or crosses, spread like wildfire, pun absolutely intended. For many converts, Christianity's message of eternal life seemed a lot more convincing when its followers stared down death without flinching. Nero thought he was stamping out a nuisance. In reality, he was writing the first chapter of Christianity's rise to global prominence. The legacy of Nero's blame game also reveals something deeply Roman. The empire thrived on the spectacle of punishment. Executions weren't just about removing troublemakers, they were about putting on a show. Rome had a whole economy of death, arenas, amphitheaters, gladiatorial games, where the suffering of the few was entertainment for the many. By using Christians as scapegoats, Nero wasn't only distracting from his own failures, he was also giving the public another gruesome circus to enjoy. Yet the plan backfired in ways Nero couldn't predict. For one, his brutal methods earned him a reputation for sadism that even his loyalists found hard to defend. For another, the Christian community began to build its identity around persecution, framing Nero as one of the great villains in its history. To this day, Christian tradition often refers to him as the first true persecutor of the church. That's not exactly the legacy an emperor hopes for. You don't want to go down in history as the guy who made lions the official critics of your city's newest religion. So in the end, Nero's grand scapegoating stunt only burned him further. He thought he was saving his image by pointing at Christians and shouting, "It was them." Instead, he added, "persecutor of saints," to his already messy resume. And as we'll see in the next chapters, his reputation was about to spiral even further out of control. Because if there's one thing worse than being remembered as the emperor who let Rome burn, it's being remembered as the emperor who couldn't even frame the right people for it. Rome had barely stopped smoldering from the Great Fire when Nero unveiled his grand plan for urban renewal. But unlike a thoughtful leader who might prioritize housing for the thousands of displaced citizens, Nero decided to solve the problem in the most Nero way possible, by building himself the ancient world's fanciest bachelor pad. Enter the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a palace so extravagant that even today historians debate whether it was an architectural masterpiece or the most expensive "Do Not Disturb" sign ever constructed. The scale of this vanity project was staggering, covering more than 200 acres. The Domus Aurea wasn't just a palace, it was practically a city within the city. Imagine Central Park, but instead of public greenery and joggers, it had groves of imported trees, artificial lakes and private vineyards, all reserved for Nero and his elite friends. To the average Roman citizen who had just lost their home in the fire, this was the equivalent of watching their emperor bulldoze what was left of their neighborhood to install a private amusement park. The name Golden House wasn't metaphorical either. The walls were literally gilded with sheets of gold leaf, shimmering like a perpetual Instagram filter. Artists were brought in to paint elaborate frescoes across the ceilings, creating landscapes and mythological scenes so vivid they'd make Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling look like a doodle. Marble of every imaginable color was shipped in from across the empire: red porphyry from Egypt, green serpentine from Greece, and exotic stones from as far away as North Africa. Nero wasn't just building a palace, he was staging a geological fashion show. And then there was the rotating dining room. Yes, Nero invented the ancient Roman equivalent of a luxury revolving restaurant. According to the historian Suetonius, the massive circular dining hall turned slowly, mimicking the movement of the heavens. Guests could sit back and watch the room rotate while they stuffed themselves with roasted peacock and stuffed dormice. Engineers likely powered it with a system of gears and water, which means that while the rest of Rome was hauling buckets to rebuild their lives, Nero was busy installing history's first Lazy Susan on steroids. The palace also had artificial waterfalls, secret passageways, and gardens designed to make one feel transported to a mythological paradise. Statues stood at every corner, including an absolutely massive bronze colossus of Nero himself, nearly 100 feet tall, standing at the entrance. If anyone was unclear about whose house this was, the giant metal self-portrait cleared things up. Subtlety was not Nero's strong suit. For ordinary Romans, this palace was a slap in the face. They were still crammed into hastily built tenements after the fire, while Nero enjoyed a luxurious villa that made Caesar's old digs look like a roadside inn. To make matters worse, the land used for the Domus Aurea wasn't just abandoned ruins. Much of it had been confiscated from wealthy Roman families whose homes survived the fire. In other words, Nero didn't just rise from the ashes, he evicted half of Rome's aristocracy to do it. The sheer extravagance of the Domus Aurea became a lasting symbol of Nero's self-indulgence. Roman senators and historians later sneered at it as proof that he cared more about golden ceilings than governing. Even when future emperors like Vespasian and Trajan took over, they couldn't stand the sight of it. Much of the palace was stripped, buried, or repurposed. The site where the Colosseum stands today was once part of Nero's artificial lake, drained and replaced with something the public could actually enjoy. Ironically, the destruction of the Golden House helped cement Nero's legacy. Every time a new emperor wanted to prove they were more responsible, they had to undo Nero's architectural excesses. Still, one has to admire the ambition, if not the taste. The Domus Aurea pushed the boundaries of Roman architecture and engineering. It was bold, innovative, and frankly insane. A palace designed not just to impress, but to overwhelm. Standing inside must have felt like walking into another world, one where the laws of nature and common sense bent to the whims of a single man with too much power and far too much gold leaf. The humor of it all. Rome was literally ashes, and Nero's big takeaway was, what this city really needs is a deluxe Airbnb with a rotating buffet. He was less a statesman and more an emperor, auditioning for an ancient episode of Cribs. But perhaps the most poetic part of the Domus Aurea's story is that its lavish frescoes hidden underground when later emperors buried the palace were rediscovered during the Renaissance. Artists like Raphael and Michelangelo crawled into those forgotten chambers, torch in hand, and were blown away by the ancient designs. So in a strange twist of fate, Nero's vanity project indirectly inspired some of the greatest art of the Renaissance. That's right. The man who fiddled while Rome burned accidentally gave us the Sistine Chapel. Not bad for a guy whose idea of crisis management was installing a fountain in his living room. For years, Nero had tested Rome's patience. He had burned through their treasury like a teenager with access to dad's credit card, forced senators to applaud his questionable theatrical performances, and turned Rome's skyline into his own personal Pinterest project. But eventually, even the most indulgent empire has its limits. By the late 60s CE, Rome had reached that critical point where everyone collectively agreed, this guy has to go. The spark wasn't even dramatic at first. It began in the provinces, always a bad sign for emperors who preferred to live in palaces instead of keeping tabs on armies. Governors and generals, the real muscle of the empire, were starting to ask themselves a dangerous question. Why are we listening to a man who thinks he's the reincarnation of Apollo but can't balance a budget? The first real challenge came from Hispania Tarraconensis, modern-day Spain, under the governor Servius Sulpicius Galba. Galba was a classic Roman general, old, cranky, and allergic to nonsense. When Nero tried to squeeze more tax money out of the provinces to pay for his Golden House renovations and musical world tour, Galba basically said, "Nah, we're not doing that." And in Roman politics, nah was the closest thing to signing someone's death certificate. Galba declared himself legatus senatus populique Romani, a fancy way of saying the Senate and people of Rome are with me. Whether the Senate actually agreed was up for debate, but Galba understood the optics, and once one general stands up to the emperor, others tend to follow like it's the world's deadliest game of dominoes. Not long after, Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gaul, also rose in revolt. Vindex was fiery, ambitious, and unlike Nero, a man who knew how to win people over without singing at them for 6 hours straight. He rallied local tribes, proclaiming Galba as the rightful emperor. Suddenly, Nero, who once imagined himself adored by his people, was facing a reality check. The provinces were no longer his fan club. To make matters worse, even when Vindex was defeated in battle, the damage was done. The illusion of Nero's unshakable rule had cracked. Soldiers across the empire began to whisper, if Galba can do it, why not us? Back in Rome, the Senate had tolerated Nero's antics for years. Senators had sat through his recitals, applauded his divine voice, and nodded politely as he compared himself to Hercules. But when the provinces openly rebelled, the Senate finally realized that Nero wasn't a visionary artist misunderstood by history. He was a liability. By 68 CE, Nero's approval rating was so low that even his Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers sworn to protect him, were switching sides. Money talks, and Galba promised them bonuses. It turns out loyalty is nice, but a fat paycheck is nicer. When word reached Nero that the Senate had officially declared him a hostis publicus, a public enemy, he panicked. The man who once strutted on stage in glittering costumes was suddenly shaking in his sandals. This was Rome's equivalent of getting cancelled, except instead of angry tweets, it came with swords. Nero fled the city, hoping to rally some kind of resistance, but the empire had already decided his mixtape wasn't worth listening to anymore. Abandoned by his guards, his advisors, and even his slaves, Nero found himself alone, hiding in the villa of a freedman named Phaon. Imagine the ruler of the known world reduced to squatting in a country house, asking his servant if there was still any wine left. For once in his life, Nero wasn't performing for an audience. He wept, muttered about how the world didn't appreciate his artistry, and wondered aloud if history would remember him fondly. Spoiler, it didn't. When he finally received confirmation that troops were on their way to arrest him, Nero realized the game was over. The Senate hadn't just fired him, they wanted him dead. His guards wouldn't fight for him, and no cavalry was riding to his rescue. Nero's last moments are the stuff of tragic theatre, fitting for a man who lived as though life was one long stage performance. Unable to bring himself to commit suicide, he begged his secretary Epaphroditus to help him. With shaking hands, he drove a dagger into his throat. His famous last words, "Qualis artifex perio," what an artist dies in me. It was the ultimate irony. Rome didn't want an artist. It wanted a competent emperor. Instead, it got a man who saw himself as the headliner of history's strangest talent show, and when the curtain fell, nobody clapped. Think of it this way, Nero was basically that friend who insists on playing you his SoundCloud tracks at every party. At first, you smile politely, then you start making excuses to leave early. Eventually, the whole neighborhood bands together, calls the cops and shuts it down. The difference is, in Nero's case, the party was the Roman Empire. If history had a flair for irony, Nero was its favorite child. The emperor who once strutted on stage before unwilling audiences would, in the end, perform his last act for nobody. Rome had had enough. The Senate branded him a public enemy. The Praetorian Guard, his supposed protectors, decided guarding him wasn't worth the trouble. And the people, who once endured his 6-hour operas, were not about to rally behind a man whose solution to a citywide crisis was installing a golden fountain in his new palace. Nero, for all his delusions of grandeur, discovered the truth every theatre kid eventually does. The audience can and will leave. When word reached him that Galba, a general in Spain, had declared himself emperor with the Senate's blessing, Nero panicked. Rome's golden boy was suddenly yesterday's meme. He fled the palace with a handful of freedmen, disguising himself in a shabby cloak. Imagine the emperor who once demanded the spotlight now sneaking out of the capital like a teenager busted for breaking curfew. The man who compared himself to Apollo now looked more like a fugitive from a bad play. Nero's destination was the villa of a loyal freedman, Phaon, just outside Rome. But even getting there was a humiliating journey. Hiding his face with a scarf, he crept through back roads, begging people not to recognize him. It's one thing to rule the Roman Empire. It's another to whisper, "Don't tell anyone you saw me," while tripping over brambles in the dark. His grand finale was less Julius Caesar's noble death, and more a sitcom escape gone wrong. Once at the villa, Nero did what any self-absorbed artist would. He rehearsed. Knowing that suicide might be his only way out, he paced, muttered lines and reportedly begged, "Is there no one to help me die?" Even in his last moments, Nero refused to go unscripted. He handled mortality the same way he handled music, with unnecessary drama and a total disregard for his audience's patience. The end came quickly. The Senate's forces were closing in, and Nero knew what awaited him if he were captured: humiliation, torture, and a very public execution. Romans had a knack for creative punishments, and Nero, who had provided them with years of horror, was sure they'd deliver poetic justice. Instead of facing the humiliation of being paraded through the streets, Nero finally did the one thing he had spent his life avoiding. He took responsibility. Well, sort of. He still couldn't bring himself to drive the dagger home. He hesitated, cried, and begged his companions to show him how it was done. Finally, with the help of a loyal secretary, Epaphroditus, Nero plunged a dagger into his throat. According to legend, his final words were, "Qualis artifex perio." What an artist dies in me. If you're wondering whether his last thought was about the empire, his people, or even his own family, the answer is no. Nero's parting gift to the world was essentially a self-congratulatory mic drop. And thus, in 68 CE, the last male descendant of Augustus exited stage left, Rome's first imperial dynasty, the Julio-Claudians, was finished. The city that had once tolerated Nero's ego was left leaderless, plunging into a chaotic civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Rome had no time to mourn its fallen artist. It was too busy scrambling for anyone who could keep the empire intact. But Nero's memory was hard to shake. For years afterward, rumors swirled that he hadn't really died. Imposters cropped up across the empire, claiming to be the emperor, hoping to spark rebellion. Some Romans, bizarrely enough, even wished he'd come back. It was the ancient equivalent of Elvis sightings, only with more murder and fewer sequins. The Nero Redivivus legends haunted Rome for decades, proof that even in death he knew how to command an audience. Historians, for their part, haven't been kind. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio all painted Nero as a deranged tyrant, a man more obsessed with performance art than governance. And while some modern scholars have tried to argue that perhaps he wasn't quite as monstrous as tradition suggests, it's hard to overlook the body count, the golden palace built on Rome's ashes, and the string of very dead family members. Nero may not have literally fiddled while Rome burned, but he certainly fiddled with everything else, usually until it broke. In the end, Nero's story is less about a misunderstood artist and more about what happens when unchecked power meets unchecked ego. He dreamed of being remembered as a cultural icon, the emperor who brought music, theater, and beauty to Rome. Instead, his legacy is a cautionary tale. Don't let your personal mixtape distract you from, running an empire. Rome survived Nero. In fact, it outlasted him by centuries. But his memory remains one of history's great cautionary punchlines. His life was a play with too many acts, too much melodrama, and an ending that, like all of Nero's performances, went on a little too long. Because at the end of the day, Nero wasn't just an emperor, he was Rome's most infamous failed artist. And even in death, he couldn't resist treating the world like a stage. Before we dive into the tale of how pockets became humanity's greatest fashion rebellion, let's start with a simple question. What do you do with your stuff if you don't have pockets? Your phone, your wallet, your keys, maybe a snack or two? Today we take the humble pocket for granted, those little stitched squares that hold our entire lives. But rewind a few hundred years and you'd discover a world where pocketless wasn't a fashion statement, it was the default. And let me tell you, humanity struggled. In medieval Europe and even earlier, people carried their belongings in pouches tied to belts or straps slung around the waist. Imagine dangling your coins, combs, and maybe a piece of dried meat for later like a fashion-forward squirrel. It wasn't exactly discreet. These little pouches were handy, sure, but also a nightmare. Thieves could snatch them in a crowd, they swung awkwardly when you ran, and if you were clumsy enough, you could sit down and send your entire portable bank account skittering across the tavern floor. Think of it as the world's first fanny pack, but one that never zipped, often tangled itself in your tunic, and had zero neon colors to make it ironically cool. It was function over form, with the unfortunate downside of being highly stealable. And of course, if you were traveling through a crowded market, you'd essentially be ringing a dinner bell for pickpockets. If there's one thing history teaches us, it's that medieval thieves were disturbingly talented. They could cut a pouch from your belt and vanish before you even finished haggling over a turnip. Now, you might wonder why pockets weren't just sewn into clothes from the start. The answer? Clothes weren't exactly designed with utility in mind. Fashion was about displaying wealth, class, or your family's sense of drama through oversized sleeves and layers upon layers of fabric. You weren't supposed to be shoving things into those clothes. You were supposed to be admired in them. Having a lump of coins bulging out of your tunic. Social disaster. So instead, people leaned on their trusty pouches. Men wore them. Women wore them. Even children wore them. If you were rich, your pouch could be embroidered, bejeweled, or silk-lined, which made it both a status symbol and an even bigger target for thieves. If you were poor, your pouch was likely just a scrap of leather with a drawstring, durable enough to survive muddy streets and bad weather. Either way, the pouch was the great equalizer. Everyone needed one. But here's where things got complicated. Society was already developing more stuff to carry. By the late Middle Ages, coins were more common. Small tools like knives were essential, and people began carrying devotional items like rosaries or prayer books. For women, especially, pouches were expected to hold everything from sewing needles to herbal remedies to the occasional baked good for a snack. Medieval ladies weren't wandering around with tote bags after all. They had one small sack tied to their waist and a long dress to trip over while juggling it all. The result? Chaos. Imagine trying to cook, mend clothes, and herd children with your only storage unit flapping against your leg like an uncooperative dog. If you needed something quickly, you'd be left fumbling through a tiny leather sack, praying the whole time you wouldn't spill its contents. Honestly, it was less of a pouch and more of a portable frustration device. And while men may have had an easier time, their pouches weren't immune to mockery either. Some were so large and oddly shaped that they earned nicknames and jokes, many of them less than polite. Let's just say history proves you give a man a bulging leather sack strapped to his waist, and someone will eventually write a crude song about it. Of course, not everyone relied on belt pouches. In some regions, wealthy people employed servants to carry their belongings, which was the medieval equivalent of having a personal assistant with a tote bag. But that luxury wasn't available to most, and so the rest of society clung quite literally to their little tied-on bags. The practical need for storage was undeniable. As societies became more mobile, people were traveling farther, carrying more coins for trade, and needing tools on hand for daily life. The problem was that pouches weren't secure, they weren't subtle, and frankly they weren't fashionable. A dangling bag just didn't scream power and sophistication, it screamed, "I'm one sharp tug away from losing my life savings." This was the world before pockets. Inconvenient, unsafe, and incredibly clumsy. And yet, it laid the groundwork for something revolutionary. Because the moment someone thought, what if I just cut a hole into my clothes and stash my stuff inside? Fashion and function finally collided in a way that changed everything. But for now, picture it. A medieval street full of jingling pouches, people clutching at their belts nervously, thieves sharpening their knives with excitement, and no one realizing that a tiny stitched square of fabric would someday save them all. The good news? Storage problems eventually found a solution. The bad news? That solution wasn't coming for a few more centuries. Until then, humanity made do with the world's earliest, least glamorous fanny pack. By the time the Middle Ages rolled around, humanity had figured out one important truth. If you didn't want your stuff stolen, you had better keep it closer to your body than dangling from a belt like a dinner bell for thieves. Enter the pouch, the unsung hero of medieval storage solutions. Forget sleek leather wallets or the tidy convenience of jeans pockets. Medieval folks tied soft leather bags to their waists and hoped for the best. Imagine an entire society where people basically accessorized like medieval kangaroos. Pouches were versatile. Men carried them, women carried them, children carried smaller versions for their pebbles, dice, or whatever passed as medieval fidget toys. These pouches held coins, keys, prayer beads, herbs, little knives, and occasionally things you absolutely wouldn't expect, like love tokens or charms meant to ward off evil spirits. That's right, your handy bag might be simultaneously holding your rent money and your superstitious insurance policy against demons. Practicality and paranoia lived happily side by side in medieval fashion. But let's talk about the eternal problem, pickpockets. The Middle Ages were a golden era for anyone who had quick fingers and no moral compass. A bag swinging at your hip was like an open invitation. Hello, thieves. Please relieve me of my valuables, preferably before I even notice. In response, people began to hide their pouches under their layers of clothing. That meant strapping a bag around your waist, then piling a tunic, maybe another tunic, a surcoat and a cloak over it. Getting to your money suddenly required the same effort as breaking into a medieval fortress. Sure, it slowed down thieves, but it also slowed down the actual owner. Imagine digging through 3 layers of wool just to tip your local alehouse keeper. For women, the hidden pouch was even more common. Medieval dresses were long and flowing, with layers upon layers of fabric. Somewhere under all that linen and wool, a discreet slit allowed access to a pouch tied around the waist. That slit worked like a primitive zipper, a secret opening to your medieval storage compartment. If you needed to grab a coin, or perhaps a sweet-smelling herb to mask the less than delicate odors of the street, you'd reach in and pull it out like a magician producing rabbits. Of course, you also had to hope you didn't grab the wrong bag by accident, because while reaching for lavender you might come out with your knife instead. And then there's the codpiece. Technically not a pocket, but it definitely deserves honorable mention in the weird fashion meets storage category. Originally, the codpiece was nothing more than a fabric triangle to cover the gap between 2 hose legs. But, as medieval fashion had a tendency to do, it quickly escalated. By the 15th and 16th centuries, codpieces had grown to outrageous proportions. They were padded, stiffened, embroidered, and decorated as if competing in a contest titled, "Look at Me." A few codpieces were even functional. Some included little flaps or pouches. Imagine the audacity of carrying around your loose change in the most conspicuous garment possible, coins jingling from your crotch. Now that's a fashion statement. Of course, pouches weren't just about survival or flamboyant displays. They also became works of art. Wealthy nobles would commission embroidered bags decorated with intricate designs, flowers, coats of arms, or religious symbols. A pouch wasn't just a storage unit. It was an opportunity to say, yes, I'm rich enough to keep my money in a bag worth more than your house. These embroidered pouches sometimes doubled as gifts. Giving a loved one a finely decorated bag wasn't just thoughtful, it was deeply personal, like gifting someone a luxury handbag today, except with a lot more sheep wool involved in the production process. The cultural role of pouches also extended to rituals. Pilgrims heading to holy sites carried special bags known as scrips, marked with badges from their journeys. These were part wallet, part spiritual passport, and part fashion accessory. A pilgrim pouch said, "I walked 300 miles to see a holy relic, and all I got was this badge-covered bag and a sore back." Meanwhile, in courtly love traditions, ladies sometimes gave knights pouches embroidered with tokens of affection. Nothing says good luck in your joust like a delicately stitched coin purse dangling from your belt. But let's not forget how vulnerable all this fabric was to the elements. A leather pouch might resist rain, but cloth bags? Forget it. Medieval people constantly risked soggy bread, rusted keys, and herbs turned into unpleasant mush. There's a reason why historical accounts are littered with complaints about ruined goods. It turns out waterproofing technology was a little behind schedule, so while medieval folks did their best, every thunderstorm was essentially a personal attack on their storage system. In the end, the pouch was more than just a medieval storage solution. It was a reflection of daily life. It showed how people balanced necessity, fashion, superstition, and status, all tied neatly to their belts, or in some cases strategically displayed in a codpiece. To carry a pouch was to carry your world with you, whether it was money, relics, charms, or just a bit of bread for the road. By the 16th and 17th centuries, fashion was not just about looking good, it was about proving you were a person of means, someone who could afford fabrics, lace, and the occasional hat shaped like a small UFO. But alongside all the ruffs, cuffs, and codpieces, something revolutionary began happening. Pockets started sneaking their way into the wardrobe, or more accurately, half of humanity got them sewn in, while the other half got saddled with a clever workaround. Let's start with the guys. Men's fashion in this era was undergoing an identity crisis. Doublets, a kind of padded jacket, and breeches were becoming more tailored and structured, meaning there was finally room to hide little compartments in the seams, and so the sewn-in pocket was born. These were practical, if not exactly capacious. You weren't going to fit a loaf of bread or your favorite hunting falcon in there, but you could tuck away coins, letters, and the occasional handkerchief, because apparently one must always be prepared to swoon dramatically or wave farewell with flair. Women, meanwhile, had an entirely different pocket trajectory. Dresses of the time weren't made with sewn-in storage. Instead, women wore tie-on pockets, essentially small bags fastened with ribbons or strings around the waist, worn under the many layers of skirts and petticoats. These weren't tiny little slips of cloth either. They could be surprisingly spacious, sometimes big enough to carry sewing tools, keys, mirrors, perfume, snacks, and even small books. Picture someone casually walking around with half a library swinging from their hips, hidden beneath mountains of fabric. They weren't so much wearing fashion as they were wearing a mobile storage unit. The genius of the tie-on pocket was its invisibility. To access it, a woman reached through a discreet slit in her skirt fabric and slipped her hand into the pocket underneath. From the outside, no one would be the wiser. For pickpockets, this was both a frustration and an invitation. If you could find the slit, you might strike it rich, but if you fumbled, congratulations, you were now groping someone in public and on your way to a very unpleasant legal outcome. But invisibility also had its drawbacks. Imagine fumbling around in a multi-layered outfit, trying to retrieve a snack you stashed away 3 hours earlier. By the time you found the right pocket under 3 skirts and a petticoat, the food might have been cold, or worse, forgotten altogether. It was the early modern version of rooting around the back seat of your car for that granola bar you swore you bought last week. Now, these tie-on pockets weren't only practical, they were also little works of art. Women embroidered them with flowers, initials, or decorative patterns, even though very few people would ever actually see them. It was a bit like decorating the inside of your sock, a secret flourish of beauty that was just for you. In fact, many extant examples we have in museums today are exquisitely embroidered, suggesting that for women, even the unseen parts of their wardrobe deserved a touch of artistry. Meanwhile, men's sewn-in pockets were less whimsical but more liberating. They didn't have to tie or untie anything, didn't have to reach through hidden slits, and certainly didn't have to juggle storage under 10 pounds of fabric. The pocket was just there, loyal and reliable. This early gender divide in pocket history would set the stage for centuries of inequality in storage space, foreshadowing the long-running battle of men get actual pockets, women get decorative pocket-shaped lies. But back in the 16th and 17th centuries, tie-on pockets did have one unexpected advantage. They were detachable. If you were mugged, you could sometimes slip off your pocket and toss it away, preserving your dignity and possibly your life. A bit like today's detachable car stereo faceplates, except instead of preventing theft, you were essentially handing the thief exactly what they wanted. On the flip side, this detachability made laundering and mending easier. Your dress could be washed or repaired separately, while your pocket full of all your personal treasures could stay safe and dry. Of course, there were awkward moments too. Tie-on pockets weren't permanently fixed to a garment, so they could sometimes slip or jangle around when you walked. Worse yet, if your skirt slit wasn't aligned properly with the pocket opening, you'd spend half the day trying to locate your own storage, contorting like a human pretzel to find where your scissors or mirror had gone. It's a little comforting to know that losing your keys was just as universal a problem 400 years ago as it is today. One fascinating little wrinkle: pockets were sometimes used to smuggle contraband. Because they were hidden under layers of fabric, women could sneak food, money, or even love letters without arousing suspicion. Imagine the spy movies we could have had. A daring courier slipping coded messages into her tie-on pocket, waltzing past guards who were none the wiser. James Bond may have had gadgets, but early modern women had skirts with built-in smuggling compartments. So by the end of this period, 2 paths of pocket history had clearly diverged. Men were walking around with sewn-in storage that gave them easy access to their daily essentials. Women, on the other hand, were hauling around secret tied-on cupboards, hidden beneath layers of skirts, roomy enough to fit half their household. Both systems worked, but they hinted at a deeper truth. Society had already begun drawing a line between men's convenience and women's inconvenience, one pocket at a time. Funny angle? Well, let's just say, in the early modern era, men got neat little stitched compartments, while women basically got portable cupboards strapped under their dresses. It was less light storage solution and more bring your own furniture. If the Middle Ages gave us the humble pouch and the early modern period experimented with tie-on or stitched-in options, then the 18th century was the glorious golden age of the pocket. And by pocket, I don't mean the tiny stitched squares you're probably thinking of in your jeans. No, these were more like portable vaults, fabric storage units that could swallow up half a household pantry. For women especially, pockets weren't just about carrying a handkerchief or some spare change. They were secret worlds, stitched in linen and tied under layers of skirts, vast enough to make Mary Poppins' carpet bag look underwhelming. By the early 1700s, women's tie-on pockets had graduated from useful to are you moving house with that thing? They were tied around the waist with tapes, tucked under voluminous skirts, and accessible through discreet slits in the fabric. And here's the fun part. These weren't just dainty accessories. Some were nearly the size of handbags or even satchels. Need to carry your sewing kit? Toss it in. What about a bit of cheese for later? In it goes. Money, keys, thimbles, prayer books, fruit, a flask of brandy for emergencies. Yes, all of that could fit in a single pocket. There are documented cases of women carrying entire small loaves of bread, or even, no exaggeration, roast chickens. Imagine pulling a cooked bird out of your outfit at a social gathering. Oh, don't mind me, just a light snack. And because these pockets were worn under multiple layers of fabric, they were the ultimate anti-pickpocket device. Street thieves might swipe from an exposed purse, but digging under a lady's skirts was not exactly a discreet strategy. Unless you had very creative methods of theft, you weren't getting in there. Meanwhile, men's fashion in the 18th century was all about sleek tailoring and neat silhouettes. Men's coats were cut close to the body with breeches fitted snugly around the legs. Their pockets? Yes, sewn in, and yes, practical, but modest in size. Think handkerchief, coins, maybe a snuff box if you were the fashionable type. This contrast was striking. Women walked around with portable storage cupboards, while men had the 18th century equivalent of a wallet stuffed into their trousers. A man could pat his coat and say, "See, I have everything I need." A woman could respond, "Wonderful, I have everything you need too, plus tonight's dinner, tomorrow's sewing project, and possibly a small dog." Pockets were more than fabric. They were tied to ideas of freedom, privacy, and autonomy. A woman with deep, roomy pockets had control over her possessions in a society where property rights for women were often restricted. She could carry her own money, her own keys, her own tools. She could store letters that nobody else was meant to read. Hidden beneath her skirts, these pockets were secret domains, untouchable, invisible, and absolutely personal. Men's pockets, by contrast, were visible, smaller, and part of the outward show of neatness. They reflected a fashion culture that prized symmetry and order in male dress. A gentleman's coat pocket wasn't for stashing snacks or smuggling a roast chicken. It was a tidy repository for a lace handkerchief or a watch fob, the visible accessories of wealth and refinement. The funniest part of this pocket revolution is the scale. Surviving examples of women's tie-on pockets show they could easily be 16 inches wide and 20 inches long. Basically the size of a modern tote bag, except hidden under petticoats. Imagine the domestic arguments. Husband, where's the candlestick? Wife pulls it out from under her skirt. I've got it right here. Never. Did you bring the thread? Wife pulls out full sewing kit. Of course. Friend, we need lunch for the road. Wife pulls out bread, cheese, and flask of brandy, already packed. Meanwhile, her husband pats his jacket pocket proudly, producing a small box of snuff. Not exactly equal contributions. Of course, all of this was enabled by the fashions of the time. Women's skirts in the 18th century were vast, wide panniers, layered petticoats, flowing gowns. With all that fabric, there was plenty of room to hide giant pockets. If you've ever seen portraits of women with skirts that could double as small tents, you'll understand how a pocket the size of a handbag wasn't even noticeable. This marriage of fashion and function created a uniquely practical moment in clothing history. For once, women had both style and utility. They could look grand and elegant while still having more storage space than most modern handbags. It was like winning the historical lottery of convenience, but like all golden ages, this one wouldn't last forever. By the late 18th century and into the 19th, women's skirts began to slim down. That meant less fabric, less volume, and less space for cavernous tie-on pockets. Eventually, these practical powerhouses of storage would fade, replaced by smaller external handbags that could never quite measure up. But for one glorious century, women ruled the storage game. While men fiddled with their tiny sewn-in coat pockets, women walked around with private, portable cupboards, hidden under silk and lace. A man might keep a folded letter in his pocket. A woman might keep an entire chapter of her life. The funny angle? A man could fit a handkerchief in his pocket. A woman could fit a roast chicken. And honestly, who was winning fashion then? If the 18th century was the golden age of cavernous tie-on pockets, the 19th century was the dark age, the moment when women collectively reached into their skirts and realized their storage space had been stolen. It wasn't a robbery, though. It was worse. It was fashion. And fashion is always the sneakier thief. The 19th century brought industrialization, which churned out clothing faster than ever before. Tailors were no longer hand-sewing bespoke garments for every individual. Factories and ready-to-wear shops were on the rise. For men, this was great news. Their coats and trousers came pre-installed with functional, well-stitched pockets. Mass production actually standardized pockets for them. The morning routine of a man in the 19th century now included a confident pat-down wallet in one pocket, handkerchief in another, maybe a watch tucked into a waistcoat slit. Convenience was stitched directly into their identity. But for women, industrialization introduced not a pocket revolution, but a pocket extinction. Women's fashion in the 19th century began to drift towards sleek, tightly fitted silhouettes. The early 1800s saw the Empire waist dress, a high-waisted flowing gown inspired by classical Greek statues. Lovely to look at, terrible for storage. Try tying a massive secret pocket around your waist under one of those diaphanous gowns, and suddenly the graceful drape starts looking like you smuggled a toddler under your skirt. By the mid-19th century, things got worse. Dresses ballooned outwards with crinolines and hoop skirts. These cages of steel and fabric were a nightmare for the pocket enthusiast. Sure, in theory, there was plenty of room under those bell-shaped skirts, but the slim bodices and tightly cinched waists left no place for a discreet slit that allowed access to tie-on pockets. The result? Women's secret storage systems were squeezed out of existence. Enter the handbag. Since women could no longer realistically wear tie-on pockets, fashion innovators introduced small decorative bags known as reticules. These were dainty drawstring purses, often embroidered or beaded, meant to dangle from the wrist. Essentially, women traded in their glorious cavernous 18th century chicken-holding pockets for a dainty pouch that could barely hold a visiting card and a coin. Practical? Not at all. Pretty? Absolutely. Men, meanwhile, were casually walking around with their entire filing system built into their trousers and coats. They had breast pockets, inside coat pockets, trouser pockets, even little coin pouches sewn into waistbands. If a man wanted to carry a notebook, some loose change and a pipe, his wardrobe had it covered. Women, however, were reduced to hauling around what amounted to fancy drawstring jewelry boxes. And here's where things took a darker cultural turn. This wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about symbolism. The shrinking of women's pockets coincided with the rise of gendered ideas about dependency. A woman with no storage had to rely on men to carry the essentials: money, keys, and documents. Even something as simple as paying for a carriage ride became an act of dependence. After all, if your only storage option was a tiny embroidered pouch the size of a hamster, you weren't exactly hauling around much autonomy. Magazines of the time even poked fun at the ridiculous nature of women's reticules, while simultaneously praising the elegance of dresses without bulky bulges. Fashion was making a statement. Women were meant to be ornamental, not practical. A pocketless existence was no accident. It was a design philosophy. The irony? Women didn't take this lying down. Many kept experimenting with hidden pockets anyway. A few clever dressmakers sewed small, nearly invisible compartments into the folds of skirts or under layers of fabric. These secret stashes were used to carry necessities discreetly. In some cases, women hid love letters, sewing kits, or even money in tiny interior pockets, invisible to the outside eye. It wasn't the glorious storage space of earlier centuries, but it was an act of quiet rebellion. And let's not forget that some women went beyond simple fashion rebellion. As the 19th century progressed, movements like suffrage were gaining momentum. Some suffragettes even linked the lack of pockets to larger social inequities. Why, they asked, should men have functional storage while women had to dangle useless accessories from their wrists? Campaigners for women's rights began using the pocket as a metaphor for broader issues of independence and equality. The situation was so absurd that satirists of the time couldn't resist. Cartoons mocked women's tiny bags, showing them trying and failing to fit anything useful inside. Imagine a caricature of a lady with a massive hoop skirt, stoically holding a reticule that barely contained a single handkerchief, while her husband stuffed everything from newspapers to cigars into his roomy trousers. The visual joke wrote itself. By the end of the 19th century, handbags became more varied and sophisticated, eventually turning into a fashion staple. Yet the essential injustice remained. Men had pockets designed into their clothes, while women had to carry storage as a separate accessory. It was as if society said, men are functional, women are decorative. Funny angle? Men got convenient storage compartments like walking Swiss Army knives. Women got a lifetime subscription to decorative sacks dangling from their wrists. The pocket crisis wasn't just a quirky fashion story. It was a reminder of how deeply clothing can shape and limit daily life. So the next time you complain about your skinny jeans having fake pockets, just remember, things could be worse. You could be a 19th century woman trying to smuggle a coin into a pouch the size of a walnut, while your husband casually slips his pocket watch, cigar case, wallet, and half a sandwich into his coat. We live in an age where you can store the entire world's knowledge in a device that fits in your hand, where drones can deliver pizza, and where cars drive themselves. And yet brace yourself for the cruel irony. Half the population still can't reliably store a phone in their jeans, without it either falling out or making an unflattering rectangular bulge. Yes, we are now deep into the 21st century, and the pocket problem is far from solved. Let's start with the obvious. Men's and women's clothing still treat pockets like a gendered luxury. Men's pants, endless caverns of storage space. They can comfortably stash a wallet, a phone, a pack of gum, and a small paperback novel, all without breaking a sweat. Women's pants, a cruel joke. Designers frequently give them shallow, decorative pockets that could barely hold a postage stamp, let alone the essentials of modern life. To add insult to injury, some pockets aren't even pockets at all. They're stitched shut, teasing the possibility of utility, only to reveal emptiness. It's as though fashion designers are cackling from their studios. Functional storage for women, perish the thought. This injustice hasn't gone unnoticed. Entire corners of the internet have turned into battlegrounds of pocket memes and rants. Women post pictures of the pathetic space in their jeans compared to men's, measuring their pocket depth with iPhones like archaeologists measuring artifacts. Others gleefully document those rare unicorn brands that actually make pants with real functioning pockets, as if discovering Atlantis. One viral meme sums it up perfectly. Men's pockets can fit a Nintendo Switch. Women's pockets can fit 3 Tic Tacs. But why are we still here? Why, after centuries of progress, have we failed to achieve equal storage rights? Part of the blame lies in fashion trends that prioritize slim silhouettes over practicality. Designers argue that real pockets would ruin the clean lines of women's trousers, never mind that women still need to carry the same things men do: phones, keys, wallets, snacks, existential dread. Thus, the handbag remains the eternal accessory, tethering women to carrying separate storage while men walk around with built-in filing cabinets in their pants. Of course, there has been resistance. Utility fashion has staged a comeback in recent decades. Thanks in part to workwear aesthetics and streetwear trends, cargo pants, once derided as the uniform of suburban dads and paintball enthusiasts, are enjoying a revival. With their giant side-flapping pockets, they offer the kind of storage that makes purses unnecessary. Then there are jumpsuits, fashion's answer to I want to look stylish but also carry everything I own. These come with zippers, compartments, and enough room to smuggle an entire lunchbox. The only downside, you have to practically undress every time you go to the bathroom. Pocket gains always come with pocket pains. And then there's the rise of athleisure, leggings, joggers, and yoga pants. Many of these now come with specially designed compartments, often on the thighs or waistband, that can hold phones, keys, and even small wallets. For millions of women, this has been revolutionary. Finally, a world where you can leave the house in stretchy pants and still carry your essentials. The catch? Leggings pockets are functional only if you're okay with your belongings visibly clinging to your legs like barnacles. Tech, too, has changed the way we think about pockets. In the 19th century, all you needed was room for a coin purse. Now we demand space for smartphones, earbuds, power banks, and occasionally even tablets. Pockets haven't evolved at the same rate as our technology. The iPhone grew bigger every year, while women's jeans pockets stubbornly remained the size of thimbles. It's almost as though Steve Jobs and denim designers never sat in the same meeting. Yet there are signs of hope. Independent brands and feminist fashion movements have made real pockets a rallying cry. Some companies proudly market their clothing with slogans like, "Yes, it has pockets," as though they've just cracked the code for cold fusion. Online campaigns pressure mainstream retailers to stop making fake pockets, and many are starting to respond. We may finally be inching toward a future where your jeans can hold more than loose change. Still, the battle isn't over. Women continue to buy handbags, not always out of choice but necessity. The bag industry, worth billions annually, has every incentive to keep things the way they are. After all, why would luxury designers make pants with proper storage if it means fewer handbag sales? It's a conspiracy of fabric and leather, waged silently against practical convenience. So here we are, in the 21st century, but women's jeans pockets? Still useless. Civilization, it seems, is capable of miracles, just not the miracle of equal pocket space. The funny angle writes itself. We have wireless headphones, high-speed trains, and a space station orbiting the Earth, but women are still asking, "Can you hold this for me?" Civilization has reached the moon, invented Wi-Fi, and made self-driving cars, but women's jeans still can't hold a phone.